Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way, way back, to a world where your morning alarm is a rooster screaming directly into your soul, your breakfast is something that might generously be described as edible, and your chances of making it through a single week without some medieval catastrophe befalling you are frankly embarrassing. Picture this. You open your eyes, and instead of your ceiling fan or that little crack in the plaster you keep meaning to fix, you see rough wooden beams crawling with something that has too many legs. The air is thick, damp, and carries a perfume that can only be described as the opposite of everything pleasant. Welcome to medieval Europe. You probably won't survive this. Actually, let's be honest, you definitely won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing that. Someone's always listening at 3 a.m. from some corner of the world, and that's kind of beautiful. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here you are. It's the year 1347, give or take a few months that nobody's keeping very careful track of anyway. You're lying on what passes for a bed in this era, which is essentially a cloth sack stuffed with straw, and the straw has seen better centuries. Your back already aches. Your neck has a crick in it that would make a modern chiropractor weep with joy at the billable hours. And as you blink into the grey half-light of a medieval morning, you begin to realise, with a slow, creeping horror, that absolutely nothing about your 21st century existence has prepared you for what comes next. The room around you is small, painfully small. The walls are some combination of wattle and daub, which for those unfamiliar is essentially a lattice of wooden strips smeared with a delightful mixture of mud, clay, animal dung and whatever else was lying around. It's the medieval equivalent of drywall, except it smells alive. The floor beneath you is packed earth, possibly with some rushes scattered across it, though those rushes were fresh approximately never. There's a single window, if you can even call it that, an opening in the wall covered with a thin sheet of oiled linen. Because glass windows are for cathedrals and people who own more than one pair of shoes, you sit up and immediately something bites you. You're not sure what. Could be a flea, could be a louse, could be something entirely new to science that medieval people simply accepted as part of the morning routine. You scratch, and already you're losing this fight. Now here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The average medieval peasant's home in England around this period was roughly 12 to 15 feet on each side. One room. That's your bedroom, your kitchen, your living room, and, depending on the season, your barn. Because yes, in many parts of medieval Europe your livestock slept in the same structure as your family. Your goat is your roommate, and your goat does not respect boundaries. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person truly understood how disease spread, or whether they simply accepted illness as divine punishment, random misfortune, or the work of malevolent spirits. What we do know is that the concept of germs was about 500 years away from being taken seriously. So as you sit there on your straw mattress, inhaling air that could strip paint off a modern car, nobody around you sees anything particularly wrong with the situation. This is just morning. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Some medieval households kept a bolster cat, essentially a cat whose primary job was to sleep in or near the bed and provide warmth. It was a living, purring hot water bottle. So if you're lucky, there might be a scrawny, flea-bitten cat curled up at the foot of your straw pile, and honestly, that cat might be the nicest thing about your entire day. You swing your legs off the bed, or rather you roll sideways off the low platform, and your bare feet touch the cold, slightly damp earth floor. You're wearing a long linen shirt which serves as both your daytime undergarment and your night clothes. Laundry day is not a weekly event. Laundry day is more of a seasonal aspiration. Your shirt has a particular aroma that you're going to have to get used to, because there is no getting away from it. You are the smell. The smell is you. Outside you can hear the town beginning to stir. Somewhere a blacksmith is already hammering. A dog barks. Someone is yelling at someone else about a pig. The pig, presumably, has opinions of its own. This is the medieval morning commute. A symphony of animal noises, human arguments, and the distant tolling of a church bell that is about to become the single most important sound in your life. You stumble toward the door, a heavy wooden thing on leather hinges, and push it open. The light hits you. It's grey. Of course it's grey. You're in Northern Europe and the sky has apparently made a long-term commitment to overcast. But even through the clouds, the light is sharp enough to make you squint after the darkness of your little hovel. And then the smell hits you. We mentioned the smell inside your house, but that was merely the opening act. The street outside, and I use the word street with tremendous generosity, is an assault on every olfactory nerve you possess. But we'll get to that. Oh, we will definitely get to that. For now, just stand in your doorway, feel the cold mud between your toes, listen to the rooster making his third announcement of the morning, take it all in. Because this is day one. This is the very beginning of your medieval week, and already some part of your modern brain is whispering a quiet, desperate prayer for indoor plumbing, ibuprofen, and literally any century other than this one. You take a deep breath, regret it immediately, and step forward into the 14th century. Let's see how long you last. The smell wraps around you like a living thing. It doesn't just arrive, it layers itself, one atrocity stacked upon another, until your nostrils simply give up trying to categorize what's happening and surrender to the full symphony of medieval urban fragrance. If you've ever driven past a landfill on a hot August afternoon, you have a vague starting point. Now multiply that by a few centuries of accumulated neglect and add livestock. The street in front of you is not paved. There are places in medieval Europe where streets are paved. Some larger cities have cobblestones. A few Roman roads still survive in usable condition. But your little town is not one of those places. What you're looking at is a rutted channel of mud, straw and things you'd rather not identify. Down the centre runs an open gutter, and this gutter is doing the heavy lifting for the entire town's waste management system, which is to say it is failing spectacularly at a job it was never really qualified for. Here's what's in that gutter. Human waste, because chamber pots are emptied out of upper story windows with, at best, a shouted warning of gardes l'eau, which is where some scholars believe the English word loo comes from. There's animal waste, because the streets double as thoroughfares for pigs, geese, chickens, horses, and the occasional cow who has made a break for it. There's rotting food, there's offal from the butcher's shop 2 doors down, there's runoff from the tanner's yard. And tanning, if you're curious, involves soaking animal hides in a solution that includes generous quantities of urine and sometimes actual brains. The tanner's neighbourhood is the one place in town where even the other medieval people hold their noses. A mainstream historical fact. In London during this era, certain streets were actually named after their primary odours, or the trades that produced them. There was a street literally called Groat Cunt Lane, which gives you some idea of medieval naming conventions. But there were also streets named for the butchers, fishmongers and tanners who made their neighbourhoods particularly fragrant. Shambles, for instance, was a street of butcher shops, and the blood and offal ran openly into the gutters. The name survives in several English cities today, long after the butchers have moved on, as a kind of aromatic ghost. Historians still argue whether medieval urban dwellers were genuinely unbothered by the stench, or simply lacked alternatives. There's evidence that people did complain. Municipal records from various cities show ordinances against dumping waste in the streets, against keeping pigsties too close to neighbours, against butchers letting blood pool in public areas. The rules existed. Enforcement, however, was about as effective as a modern sign that says "please don't litter" next to a highway. People acknowledged the problem. They just didn't have the infrastructure to fix it. You're standing in your doorway and your eyes are watering, not from emotion, from the sheer chemical assault of your surroundings. A woman across the way throws open her shutters and dumps a bucket of something into the street below. She doesn't look down first. She doesn't need to. Whatever was in that bucket has joined the general current of the gutter, and life moves on. Literally, life moves on. There's something wriggling in the gutter that you refuse to examine more closely. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval cities attempted to use pigs as a rudimentary sanitation system. Pigs roamed the streets and ate the garbage. It was essentially an organic waste disposal program, except the pigs also produced waste of their own, and sometimes attacked small children, and occasionally wandered into churches during services. In 1131, the future King Philip of France was killed when a pig ran under his horse's legs and caused it to throw him. A pig changed the course of French royal succession, medieval Europe, everybody. You step gingerly into the street, and the mud squelches around your feet. You're not wearing shoes yet. Shoes are a whole separate problem we'll get to. And the sensation of cold medieval street mud oozing between your toes is something that will haunt you for the rest of your hopefully very short stay. You're trying to stick to the edges of the street, near the walls of the buildings, where the ground is marginally less revolting. This is actually what most people do, and it's one theory for why the phrase "going to the wall" once meant claiming a position of relative safety and cleanliness. The centre of the street is for the truly brave or the truly oblivious. The air carries more than just the smell of waste. There's smoke, wood smoke from every hearth in town, because it's the only way to cook and the only way to stay warm, and chimneys, while they exist in some grander buildings, are not standard equipment for your average house. Many homes vent their smoke through a simple hole in the roof, or just don't. The smoke hangs in the air, mixing with the fog and the damp, creating a permanent haze that coats everything in a thin layer of soot. Your lungs, accustomed to the relatively filtered air of the modern era, are not going to enjoy this. And then there's the sound that accompanies the smell. The flies. Medieval streets are a paradise for flies. Huge, lazy, well-fed flies that have more food sources available to them than they could process in 1,000 insect lifetimes. They buzz around the gutter, around the butcher's doorway, around the dung heap at the end of the lane that somebody was supposed to move last week and nobody ever did. They'll land on your food, they'll land on your face, they'll land on the open sore that you're going to develop on your foot in about 2 days, because you stepped on something in this exact street. But that's a problem for future you. For now, you're just trying to breathe. You're trying to orient yourself in a world where the baseline condition of public space is what a modern health inspector would classify as an active biohazard zone. The fascinating thing is that the people around you, the woman with the bucket, the man leading a donkey past you, the group of children chasing each other through the muck with bare feet and apparent joy, none of them seem distressed. This is normal. This is Tuesday. The smell is just the smell of being alive in a medieval town, and if you want to survive here, you're going to have to make peace with it. You won't, of course. Your modern nose will never fully adjust, but at least after a few hours, the sharpest edges of the stench will dull slightly, as your olfactory receptors simply burn out and stop reporting. Small mercies, very small, medieval-sized, you might say. The church bell rings again. Somewhere always a bell is ringing, and the town lurches further into its morning routine. You need to figure out food, water, clothing, and some kind of plan. But first, you need to stop standing barefoot in medieval sewage. That would be an excellent start. You look down at yourself, and the situation is not encouraging. That long linen shirt you slept in, the one that smells like it has been worn by at least 2 people before you, neither of whom believed in soap, is essentially your base layer. In the modern world, you'd call this underwear. In medieval Europe, you call this your entire wardrobe strategy's foundation, and it's going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting. The linen is rough, not slightly scratchy like a new cotton t-shirt rough. This is woven from fibres that were processed by hand, beaten with wooden tools, and spun on a wheel by someone who did not have your comfort as their primary concern. Rough. It chafes. It chafes in places you didn't know could chafe. And this is the good fabric. This is the comfortable one. Everything that goes on top of this will be worse. If you're a man in this time and place, your outfit for the day consists of a few key pieces. Over your shirt goes a tunic, essentially another long garment, heavier, made of wool. Wool in the 14th century is not the soft merino you might pick up at a modern outdoor retailer. This is coarse, minimally processed wool that retains a faint but persistent lanolin smell when dry and a powerful wet sheep smell when it rains, which is often because, and I cannot stress this enough, you're in medieval Europe and it rains constantly. The tunic falls roughly to your knees and is belted at the waist with a strip of leather or fabric. Below the waist you've got hose, not the modern kind. Medieval hose are essentially 2 separate leg coverings, each one tied to your belt or to a sort of inner garment. They leave a gap in between that is covered by your tunic, and if your tunic rides up, well, let's just say medieval modesty depends entirely on the length of your outerwear. This arrangement is basically the ancestor of trousers, but with significantly more drafts. And here's a mainstream historical fact. The colour of your clothing tells everyone around you exactly where you stand in the social hierarchy. If you're wearing undyed wool, that brownish, greyish, off-white colour, you're a peasant. The dyes used for brighter colours were expensive. Blue came from woad, or the far prissier indigo. Red came from madder root, or, for the truly wealthy, from Kermes insects, or cochineal. Purple was reserved, in some places by actual law, for royalty. Sumptuary laws, laws that regulated what people of different classes could wear, were real and enforced. Wear the wrong colour and you weren't just making a fashion faux pas, you were committing an actual crime. Your feet are another issue. If you're lucky, you might have a pair of turn shoes, leather shoes made by a cordwainer, constructed inside out and then turned right side out, which gives them a somewhat rounded, soft appearance. They have no real sole to speak of. No arch support, no cushioning. Walking in them on the muddy, rocky, debris-strewn streets of a medieval town is roughly equivalent to walking in leather socks. Your feet will hurt by midday and be developing blisters by evening. If you're not lucky, and let's face it, luck is not your strong suit in this century, you might have wooden clogs, or you might have nothing at all. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval fashion was purely functional versus genuinely expressive. There's evidence that even peasants took pride in their appearance when they could, adding small embellishments to clothing, using natural dyes from berries and bark to add subtle colour, tailoring their tunics to fit better. Fashion wasn't exclusive to the wealthy, it was just dramatically limited by resources. The desire to look decent is apparently one of humanity's most persistent traits, surviving even the 14th century. Now, if you happen to be a woman in this scenario, your outfit is equally delightful. You're wearing a long chemise underneath, similar to the men's shirt, and over that goes a kirtle, which is a fitted dress that laces or buttons up, usually in the front or side. Over the kirtle, depending on the weather and your station, you might wear a surcoat or a separate skirt-like garment. Your head is covered. This is not optional. A respectable medieval woman covers her hair in public, usually with a linen wimple or a coif or a veil of some kind. Walking around with your hair loose is making a statement, and it's not a statement that medieval society will appreciate. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people did not have elastic. Think about that for a moment. No elastic waistbands, no stretchy anything. Everything is held in place by ties, laces, belts, pins, and sheer optimism. Getting dressed in the morning is a 10-minute engineering project. Getting undressed in a hurry, say because you urgently need to use the privy, is a logistical challenge that can have genuinely unfortunate consequences. And speaking of things that are held in place by optimism, let's talk about undergarments. Men wear brays, loose linen shorts that tie at the waist. Women wear, well, this is actually a point of some scholarly debate. There's limited evidence for medieval women's underwear as a separate garment. Some historians believe women simply wore their chemise and nothing beneath it. Others point to a few archaeological finds, like a set of linen garments discovered in an Austrian castle that look remarkably like modern bras and panties, as evidence that some form of underwear existed. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some women, in some places, at some times wore some form of undergarment. Clarity is not medieval history's strong suit. You've managed to get dressed, and the whole process has taken far longer than it should have. The wool itches. The linen underneath is doing its best but losing the battle against the wool. Your shoes, if you have shoes, are already damp from the morning air. You catch a glimpse of yourself in a puddle, and you look, frankly, like an extra from a very low-budget Renaissance fair. But you're clothed. You're covered. And in a world where exposure to the elements is a genuine threat to survival, that counts for something. The morning is getting on, and your stomach is making sounds that suggest it would like to participate in the day's activities. Which brings us to the next great challenge of medieval survival. Figuring out what on earth you're going to eat. Spoiler alert, you're not going to enjoy it. Your stomach growls, and you realise with a mix of hunger and dread that there is no refrigerator, no pantry full of snacks, no corner shop, and absolutely no chance of someone delivering anything to your door unless that something is a summons to do unpaid labour for your local lord. Breakfast, as you understand it, doesn't really exist here, at least not in the way you're used to. The concept of 3 square meals a day is largely a modern invention. In medieval Europe, the main meal is dinner, served around midday, and there might be a lighter supper in the evening. Breakfast, the word itself means breaking the fast, was considered somewhat indulgent by the church, and for a while, eating early in the morning was frowned upon as a sign of gluttony. Labourers and children were generally given a pass because, well, they needed the energy. But the idea of sitting down to a nice plate of eggs and toast simply does not apply here. You eat when there's food, and you're grateful for whatever that food turns out to be. What's available, if you're a peasant? And in this scenario you almost certainly are, because roughly 80 to 90% of the medieval population worked the land. Your diet revolves around a few key staples. The first and most important is bread. Bread is the foundation of the medieval diet, the thing that separates a day of eating from a day of starving. But medieval bread is not the soft, fluffy, uniformly textured loaf you grab off a grocery store shelf. Medieval bread, especially for the lower classes, is made from whatever grain is available. Rye, barley, sometimes a mixture called maslin, and it is dense, heavy, and dark. The flour is ground on stone mills, and tiny fragments of stone end up in the flour, which end up in the bread, which end up grinding down your teeth over the years. Archaeologists can actually identify medieval skeletons partly by the extreme dental wear caused by this stone-ground flour. Your teeth are being destroyed one meal at a time, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. A mainstream historical fact: white wheat bread was a luxury item reserved for the wealthy. It was called wastel bread, and it was finer, lighter, and didn't contain as many tooth-destroying stone fragments. The social hierarchy of medieval Europe could literally be read in the colour of your bread. Dark bread meant you were poor, white bread meant you had money. Some things, it turns out, haven't changed as much as we'd like to think. Alongside your bread, the primary dish in your life is going to be pottage. Pottage is essentially a thick soup or stew made from whatever vegetables, grains and legumes are available. Onions, cabbages, turnips, peas, beans. These are your main ingredients. If you're lucky, there might be a bit of salted meat or a bone thrown in for flavour. If you're not lucky, it's just vegetables and water, simmered over a fire until everything has surrendered its individual identity and become a uniform, somewhat grey, somewhat mushy substance. You eat it with your bread. You eat it every day. You eat it until the very concept of pottage becomes a source of existential despair. Meat is a luxury, a serious luxury. If you're a peasant, you might eat meat a few times a year, maybe at a feast day, maybe if a pig is slaughtered in autumn, maybe if you manage to snare a rabbit, though that last one is complicated because hunting rights are controlled by the local lord, and poaching can get you imprisoned, fined, mutilated, or all three. The forests and the game in them belong to the nobility, and taking a deer without permission is treated roughly the same as breaking into someone's house and stealing their furniture, except with more dismemberment. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people used trenchers instead of plates. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread that served as your plate. You'd pile your food on it, eat your meal, and then either eat the gravy-soaked trencher itself or give it to the poor or the dogs. It was an edible, biodegradable plate. In some ways, it was more environmentally sustainable than anything we use today. In other ways, it was a soggy piece of bread sitting under your dinner. Perspective is everything. Historians still argue about how much variety the average medieval diet actually contained. Some scholars paint a picture of relentless monotony. Pottage and bread and pottage, day after day, season after season. Others point to evidence of seasonal fruits, nuts, herbs and foraged foods that added at least some variety to the peasant table. Wild garlic, nettles, crab apples, berries. The countryside offered things to eat if you knew where to look and if the season was right. The truth is probably that diet varied enormously depending on where you lived, what time of year it was, and whether the harvest had been good. And the harvest. Oh, the harvest. This is the thing that modern people, accustomed to supermarkets that never run out of anything, find hardest to grasp. In medieval Europe, the food supply is not a system, it's a gamble. Every year, the entire population bets its survival on the weather. Too much rain and the crops rot. Too little rain and they wither. A late frost can destroy an entire season's planting. An early frost can ruin the harvest. Hailstorms, floods, plant diseases, insect infestations. Any of these can turn a year of plenty into a year of famine. And famine is not a metaphor. It's not, we're eating a bit less this month. It's people dying. It's children dying. It's entire villages being reduced to eating bark and grass, and things that no human stomach can actually process. You sit down in front of a wooden bowl of pottage. There's a wooden spoon. The pottage is lukewarm and has the general colour and consistency of something you'd find in a garden after heavy rain. You take a bite. The bread is so hard you have to tear at it with your hands, and something crunches between your teeth that is definitely not a vegetable. You chew, you swallow, you take another bite, and somewhere in the back of your mind a small voice whispers the words meal delivery app, and you feel a sadness so profound it almost transcends time itself. But you eat. Because the alternative is not eating. And in medieval Europe, That alternative arrives faster and more brutally than you can imagine. You finish your pottage, if finish is the right word for something you mostly endured, and now your body makes another demand that you'd normally satisfy without a second thought. You're thirsty. Simple enough in the modern world. Turn on a tap, grab a bottle, fill a glass. Here in medieval Europe, that simple act of drinking water might be the thing that kills you before anything else gets the chance. The water supply in a medieval town is, by modern standards, a public health catastrophe that someone has just decided to live with. There are wells, and there are streams and rivers, and these are your options. The well in the town square draws from groundwater that has been filtering through the same soil that receives the town's accumulated waste. The stream that runs past the edge of town is also used for washing clothes, watering animals, dumping butcher's offal, and processing wool and leather. At various points upstream, other towns and villages are doing exactly the same things. What flows into your cup has already had quite a journey. A mainstream historical fact. One of the reasons ale and beer were so universally consumed in medieval Europe, including by children, was not because everyone was a raging alcoholic, but because the brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed many of the pathogens that made raw water dangerous. People didn't understand the science behind this. They didn't know about bacteria or waterborne diseases. They just knew, through centuries of observed experience, that people who drank ale tended to get sick less often than people who drank water straight from the source. It was practical wisdom dressed up as preference, so your daily beverage is going to be ale. Small ale, specifically, a weak, slightly sour brew with a low alcohol content, maybe 2 or 3%. It's brewed by alewives, who are usually women, and it's made from malted barley, water, and sometimes herbs or spices for flavouring. Hops aren't widely used in English brewing yet. That's a development that's still making its way over from the continent. The result is a drink that is cloudy, somewhat flat, faintly sweet, and not particularly strong. It won't get you drunk, it will keep you hydrated, and it won't crucially give you dysentery. Probably. Historians still argue about exactly how dangerous medieval water supplies truly were. Some revisionist scholars suggest that in rural areas with clean springs and low population density, the water was perfectly fine and the everybody drank beer because water was deadly. Narrative is overblown. They have a point. There were certainly places and times where the water was safe. But in a crowded medieval town, with the butchers and tanners and dyers and human waste all contributing to the same water table. Your modern immune system, which has been coddled by chlorinated, filtered, pH-balanced municipal water for your entire life, is not prepared for what's lurking in that well. Because here's the thing that nobody warns you about in the time travel fantasy. Your immune system is a product of your environment. Modern humans have immune systems that are very good at dealing with modern threats and spectacularly unprepared for medieval ones. The bacteria, parasites and viruses circulating in medieval Europe include strains that your body has never encountered and has no defences against. Your gut flora, the community of microorganisms in your digestive system that helps you process food and fight off infections, is calibrated for the 21st century. Throwing 14th century water into that system is like introducing a demolition crew to a china shop. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people actually had a rough hierarchy of water quality. Spring water was considered the best. It was fresh. It was clear. It was cold. River water was acceptable but suspect. Standing water, from ponds or cisterns, was considered the worst. Some medieval writers even recommended specific tests for water quality, like checking whether it was clear, whether it had a taste, and whether it left a residue when you boiled it. They couldn't articulate why some water made you sick, but they had developed surprisingly practical rules of thumb for avoiding the worst of it. Your first cup of medieval ale arrives, served in a wooden cup, because you certainly don't own a glass, and you drink. It's not terrible. It's not good either. It's the kind of drink that exists purely to fulfill a biological requirement, with no pretension toward enjoyment. You drink it the way you'd eat a granola bar at an airport. Not because you want to, but because the alternative is worse. But even the ale carries risks. The brewing standards are inconsistent. There are no food safety regulations as you'd understand them. The containers used to brew and store the ale are cleaned with water from the same questionable sources. Sometimes the ale goes off, and drinking spoiled ale can produce symptoms that range from merely unpleasant to genuinely dangerous. The alewife does her best, but her best is constrained by the same limitations that constrain everything in this world. No refrigeration, no sterilization, no understanding of microbiology. Within a day or two of arriving in medieval Europe, your stomach is going to rebel. This is essentially guaranteed. The unfamiliar bacteria in your food and drink will trigger some combination of nausea, cramps, and what polite historians refer to as gastric distress, which is a euphemism for the kind of explosive digestive episode that sends you stumbling toward the privy, which is a hole in the ground, or a plank with a hole over a pit, or just the nearest convenient spot behind a building, with an urgency that leaves no room for dignity. The medieval privy, by the way, deserves its own moment of horror. In a peasant home, it might be a simple pit latrine in the yard, covered with a wooden seat. In a town, there might be communal privies shared by multiple households. In some cities, there were public latrines built over rivers. London had a famous one called Longhouse on London Bridge, where waste dropped directly into the water below. The same water that other people downstream were drinking. The same water that you now understand with terrible clarity you should never have gone near. You put down your cup. Your stomach makes a sound like a distant thunderstorm. This is going to be a very long week. And as you contemplate the privy situation with growing anxiety, you realise that medieval survival isn't about fighting dragons or outsmarting villains. It's about your digestive system, waging a losing war against an entire world that is fundamentally incompatible with your biological expectations. You are, in the most literal sense, out of your element. And your element, it turns out, was clean water all along. So you've eaten your grim pottage, you've drunk your questionable ale, and now the medieval world presents you with its next impossible challenge. You need to do something productive, because idleness is not an option in a society where everyone works, and anyone who doesn't is viewed with suspicion, hostility, or both. The question is, what exactly can you do? The answer, from a medieval perspective, is almost certainly nothing useful. Let's take stock of your modern skill set. You can probably type 60 words per minute. You might know how to use a spreadsheet. Perhaps you have opinions about project management software. You may have once changed a light bulb and felt briefly competent. None of this matters. Not even slightly. The medieval economy runs on physical labour, specialised craft knowledge, and social structures so rigid that your position in society was essentially determined before you were born. You're arriving at this party very late, with none of the right qualifications and wearing the wrong clothes. A mainstream historical fact, the feudal system that dominated medieval European society was, at its core, a hierarchy of obligation. At the top sat the king, who technically owned all the land. Below him were the great nobles, barons, earls, dukes, who held their lands in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them were lesser lords and knights who managed individual estates. And at the bottom, doing the actual work that made the entire system function, were the peasants. Most peasants in this era were serfs, meaning they were legally bound to the land they worked. They couldn't leave without their lord's permission. They couldn't marry without their lord's permission. In some places, they couldn't even send their children to school, if schools were available, without their lord's permission. You didn't choose to be a serf. You were born one, and you died one, and the land you worked was never yours. If you've just appeared in this world with no family, no land, no lord, and no trade, you're what the medieval legal system would call a masterless person, and that is not a compliment. It means you have no place in the social order. No one is responsible for you, and no one is obligated to help you. You are, in the most practical sense, nobody. And in a society built on relationships of mutual obligation, I work your land, you protect me from bandits. Being nobody is dangerous. Vagrants and wanderers were viewed with deep suspicion. They were potential criminals, potential spies, potential carriers of disease. Towns had the right to expel them, and they frequently did. Your best hope is to find work quickly, and the most likely work available to a person with no skills and no connections is the most basic agricultural labour. Digging, carrying, hauling, spreading manure, and yes, that's a real job, and yes, it's exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. You might find employment during harvest season, when every available body is needed in the fields, but even then you'll be competing with local labourers who actually know what they're doing. Historians still argue about how much economic mobility existed in medieval society. The traditional view is that the feudal system was essentially frozen. You were born into your station and stayed there. But some historians point to evidence of peasants who accumulated enough wealth to buy their freedom, craftsmen who rose through guild ranks to become prosperous, and even serfs who fled to towns. There was a legal principle in some parts of England that if a serf could live in a chartered town for a year and a day without being claimed by their lord, they were legally free. This led to a saying, Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes you free. But the reality was messier than the principle. Freedom was hard to win and easy to lose. Here's a quirky tidbit. If you somehow stumbled into a town and wanted to learn a trade, you'd need to join a guild, and the guild system was about as welcoming as a modern country club, with a 10-year waiting list. Guilds controlled who could practice a trade, how they could practice it, what they could charge, and who could train under them. To become a craftsman, a baker, a weaver, a blacksmith, a carpenter, you'd typically need to serve an apprenticeship of 7 years, starting as a boy of around 12 or 13. You'd work for a master, live in his house, and receive no wages, only training and keep. After your apprenticeship, you'd become a journeyman, working for wages but still not permitted to set up your own shop. To become a master yourself, you'd need to produce a masterpiece, a work of sufficient quality to prove your skill, and pay a hefty fee. It was a system designed to maintain quality and limit competition, and if you're a random time traveller with 0 craft skills, it has absolutely no place for you. And even if you could somehow fast-track yourself into a trade, the work itself would be gruelling by any modern standard. A blacksmith spends his days swinging a hammer in front of a forge that reaches temperatures hot enough to make iron glow. A tanner spends his days elbow-deep in chemical baths that include urine and feces. A fuller, someone who processes wool cloth, literally stomps on fabric in tubs of stale human urine. Because the ammonia in urine is an effective cleaning agent. These are respectable trades. These are skilled professions that people were proud of, and they would destroy your soft, modern office job body in approximately 1 working day. You wander through the town, trying to look purposeful. A man near the market gives you a long look, the look of someone sizing up a stranger, deciding whether you're a threat, a nuisance, or possibly useful. You straighten up. You try to project competence. He asks you something in a dialect so thick it might as well be a different language, and in some ways, it is. Middle English in 1347 sounds nothing like the English you speak. The vowels are different. The consonants have shifted. Words you think you recognise mean something entirely different. You stammer something back and he looks at you the way you'd look at a dog that had just tried to operate a doorknob. You are going to need help. You are going to need someone to take you in, teach you something, give you a purpose. Because in medieval Europe, a person without a purpose is a person without protection. And without protection, the week you're trying to survive just got significantly shorter. The church bell has been your constant companion since you woke up, and by now you've noticed something. It doesn't ring randomly. It rings at specific intervals throughout the day, and every time it rings, the people around you respond. They pause their work, they cross themselves, they move. The bell is not a suggestion. It is the organising principle of the entire medieval day, and if you don't learn its rhythms, you will be lost in more ways than one. A mainstream historical fact. The medieval day was divided by the canonical hours, a system of prayer times established by the church that structured both religious and secular life. These hours were matins, around midnight or very early morning, lauds, dawn, prime, first hour of daylight, roughly 6 in the morning, terce, mid-morning, sext, noon, none, mid-afternoon, vespers, evening, and compline, bedtime. The church bell rang for each of these, and the bells didn't just summon monks and clergy to prayer, they told the entire town what time it was. They told craftsmen when to start and stop work, they told market traders when to open and close, they told you when to eat. The church bell was the medieval clock, and the church was the entity that controlled time itself. This is not a metaphor. In a world without watches, without clocks in most homes, without any reliable way to mark the passing of hours, whoever controls the bells controls the schedule, and the church controlled the bells. Your day begins and ends when the church says it does. Your week is structured around the church calendar. Sundays, holy days, feast days, fast days. There are days when you must attend Mass, days when you must not work, days when you must not eat meat, days when you must confess your sins. The church is not a part of medieval life. It is the framework inside which medieval life occurs, and you need to attend Mass. This is not optional. Sunday attendance is expected of every Christian in the community, and in a medieval European town, everyone is presumed to be Christian. There is no secular alternative. There is no sleeping in. There is no, I'm spiritual but not religious. If you don't show up at the parish church on Sunday, people notice. If you don't show up regularly, people talk. And if people talk enough, the conversation starts to include words like heretic, which is a conversation you want to avoid with every fibre of your being, because the medieval approach to heresy makes modern cancel culture look like a gentle suggestion. Historians still argue about the depth of genuine religious feeling among ordinary medieval people versus the extent to which religious observance was simply social conformity enforced by fear. The truth is almost certainly both. Many people were deeply, sincerely devout. They believed in heaven and hell as literal places. They believed the saints could intervene in daily life. They believed the Eucharist was the actual body and blood of Christ, not a symbol, and that participating in Mass was essential for the salvation of their immortal souls. At the same time, the Church held enormous institutional power. It could excommunicate you, which meant cutting you off from all sacraments and effectively declaring you a social outcast, or it could hand you over to secular authorities for punishment of crimes against the faith. Sincerity and fear are not mutually exclusive. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval churchgoers didn't sit in pews the way modern congregations do. Pews were a later development. In the 14th century, most people stood during Mass, or knelt on the stone floor or leaned against pillars. The service was conducted in Latin, which the vast majority of the congregation did not understand. The priest faced the altar, not the people. You couldn't see much of what was happening, and you couldn't understand the words being spoken. What you experienced was the atmosphere, the candlelight, the incense, the chanting, the towering stone arches above you, the painted walls depicting scenes of heaven and hell. It was sensory, not intellectual. It was designed to make you feel the presence of God, even if you couldn't follow the theological details. And for many people it worked. You attend your first medieval Mass, and it is unlike anything in your experience. The church itself is probably the most impressive building in town. Stone walls, a vaulted ceiling, windows that might even have coloured glass. It is cool inside and quiet, and the air smells of beeswax and something ancient. The priest intones words you don't understand. The people around you cross themselves, kneel, stand, murmur responses at intervals you can't predict. You do your best to follow along, mimicking the person next to you with a half-second delay that hopefully isn't too obvious, because being obvious is dangerous. The church's role in medieval society extends far beyond Sunday services. The church runs the hospitals, such as they are. The church runs the schools, what few exist. The church provides charity to the poor, on its own terms. The church maintains records of births, marriages, and deaths. The church mediates disputes, hears confessions, grants absolutions. And the church, through its local representatives, keeps a close eye on the spiritual health of the community, which in practice means keeping a close eye on behaviour that deviates from accepted norms. If you say the wrong thing, question a doctrine, express doubt about a miracle, suggest that maybe the relics in the church aren't genuine, you're wandering into territory that can get you investigated, tried and punished. The Inquisition, while more commonly associated with later centuries and specific regions, has its roots in this era, and local bishops and clergy have their own mechanisms for identifying and dealing with spiritual deviance. You don't need a formal inquisition to ruin your week. A suspicious neighbour, a gossiping alewife, a priest who decides you seem off. Any of these can set in motion a chain of events that ends very badly for you. So you keep your head down, you attend Mass, you cross yourself when others cross themselves, you kneel when they kneel, you mutter what you hope sounds like Latin, and you pray, sincerely for possibly the first time in your life, that nobody asks you a direct question about theology. Because the church bell that runs your life is also the bell that can toll for your downfall, and in medieval Europe the line between devout citizen and suspected heretic is thinner than the oiled linen over your bedroom window. The bell rings again, you cross yourself, you're getting good at this part, and shuffle out of the church with the rest of the congregation, back into the grey daylight and the ever-present smell. Another obligation met, another day of survival, and somewhere deep in your chest you feel something that might be the beginning of a cough. That cough, that little tickle in the back of your throat that you'd normally ignore or address with a cough drop and a cup of tea, and the vague assumption that your body will sort itself out. In the modern world, your body probably would sort itself out. You have an immune system boosted by vaccines, a medicine cabinet stocked with over-the-counter remedies, and the knowledge that if things get serious, a doctor with actual medical training is a phone call away. In medieval Europe, that cough is the opening line of a story that can end very, very badly. Let's start with what's happening to your body. You've been here for a day, maybe two. You've been sleeping in a damp room on a straw mattress colonized by insects. You've been breathing air thick with smoke, particulates, and the biological output of an entire town. You've been eating unfamiliar food and drinking water and ale that your gut flora is ill-equipped to handle. You've been walking barefoot or in inadequate shoes through streets that are functionally open sewers. Your body, which was in reasonable shape when you arrived, is now under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. A mainstream historical fact: life expectancy in medieval Europe was dramatically lower than today, but the statistics are somewhat misleading. The average life expectancy at birth was roughly 30 to 35 years, which sounds catastrophic, but that number is heavily skewed by infant and child mortality. If you survived to age 20, you had a reasonable chance of reaching your 50s or even 60s. The real killer was the first 5 years of life, where disease, malnutrition, and the sheer fragility of young human bodies claimed an enormous percentage of the population. But even adults who survived childhood lived in a world where a simple infection could be fatal, because antibiotics did not exist. That's the thing that will keep you awake at night, if the fleas don't do it first. There are no antibiotics, none. Penicillin is 600 years in the future. The concept that infections are caused by microorganisms is completely unknown. When your cough develops into a chest infection, or when the cut on your foot from stepping on something in the street turns red and swollen and hot to the touch, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, in the medieval medical toolkit that can address the underlying cause. What exists instead is humoral theory. This is the dominant medical paradigm of the medieval world, inherited from the ancient Greeks, refined by the Romans, and transmitted to medieval Europe partly through Arabic scholars who preserved and expanded upon Greek medical texts. The basic idea is that the human body contains 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is a state of balance between these 4 substances. Disease is an imbalance. Treatment, therefore, consists of restoring the balance by adding or removing humours as needed. Got a fever? That's too much blood. The treatment is to remove some. Got a cough? That might be excess phlegm. The treatment could involve foods and herbs that were believed to dry out the excess moisture. Got a persistent headache? Perhaps your black bile is elevated. The treatment might involve purgatives, substances that make you vomit or cause diarrhea to expel the excess. Every condition, every symptom, is interpreted through this framework, and the treatments that follow are at best useless and, at worst, actively harmful. Historians still argue about whether medieval medicine was entirely ineffective or whether some treatments had genuine, if accidental, benefits. Honey, for instance, was widely used on wounds, and modern research has confirmed that honey does have antibacterial properties. Certain herbal remedies, willow bark for example, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, provided real pain relief. But these occasional successes were buried in a mountain of treatments that range from the benign to the bizarre, and the theoretical framework behind them was fundamentally wrong. Here's a quirky tidbit. One popular medieval remedy for the plague involved holding a bouquet of sweet-smelling flowers and herbs to your nose, on the theory that disease was transmitted by miasma, bad air. This is the origin of the famous plague doctor image with the beaked mask stuffed with herbs and flowers. It didn't work, of course, but it smelled lovely, and in a world where the streets smelled like the inside of a medieval sewer, which they literally were, any improvement in nasal experience was probably appreciated on its own merits. So your cough gets worse, and you do what anyone in this time and place would do. You ask for help. Maybe a neighbour recommends a particular herb. Maybe someone suggests you visit the local healer, a woman probably, since informal folk medicine was largely the domain of women in the community, the wise women who knew which plants eased a cough, which poultices drew out infection, which teas calmed a stomach. These women provided the vast majority of day-to-day medical care in medieval Europe, and their knowledge, passed from mother to daughter through generations, was often genuinely useful in a limited way. But if your condition is serious, you need more than a wise woman. You need a physician, except you almost certainly can't afford one. Trained physicians in the medieval world are rare, expensive, and concentrated in cities and around the wealthy. They've studied at universities, possibly Bologna or Montpellier or Paris, where they've learned their Galen and their Hippocrates, and they approach your illness with the full weight of classical learning. They will examine your urine. They will consult astrological charts. They will prescribe a regimen of diet, rest, and humoral adjustment. And if none of that works, which it probably won't, they might recommend you see the barber surgeon. But that, as they say, is a whole different kind of nightmare, and one that deserves its own quiet, horrified moment of contemplation. The barber surgeon. Even the name should give you pause. In the modern world, the person who cuts your hair and the person who performs surgery on your body are, thankfully, two entirely different people with two entirely different sets of qualifications. In medieval Europe, these roles are combined into one cheerful, blood-spattered individual who will trim your beard, pull your rotting tooth, lance your abscess, and amputate your gangrenous limb, possibly in that order, possibly in the same afternoon. A mainstream historical fact, the division between physicians and surgeons in medieval Europe was partly a matter of class and education. Physicians were university-trained intellectuals who diagnosed illness and prescribed treatment. They were the theorists. Surgeons, by contrast, were craftsmen who worked with their hands. Literally, the word surgery comes from the Greek chirurgia, meaning handwork. Because the medieval university curriculum was rooted in classical texts and considered manual labour beneath the dignity of a learned man, physicians rarely performed surgery themselves. That job fell to barber surgeons, who learned their trade through apprenticeship, operated their own shops, and advertised their services with a red and white striped pole, the red representing blood, the white representing bandages. That barber pole still exists outside barbershops today, a cheerful relic of a time when getting a shave and getting a bone set were the same transaction. You're sitting in the barber surgeon's shop, a small room that smells of iron and something else you'd rather not identify, and the toolkit on display is enough to make you seriously reconsider your medical complaint. There are razors, obviously for the barbering side of the business. There are pliers-like instruments for pulling teeth. There are probes, lancets, and fleams, small bladed instruments used specifically for bloodletting. There are cauterizing irons, heated in the fire until they glow, used to seal wounds and stop bleeding by burning the flesh closed. There are bone saws, actual bone saws, sitting right there next to the shaving basin. Bloodletting is probably the single most common medical procedure of the medieval era. It's prescribed for almost everything: fevers, infections, headaches, melancholy, general malaise. The theory is simple. Too much blood is making you sick, so removing some will restore balance. The practice involves either cutting a vein with a lancet and letting the blood flow into a bowl, or applying leeches to the skin and letting them do the work. Leeches are considered sophisticated technology in this context. They're reusable, they're self-regulating, they drop off when they're full, and they don't require the precision of a lancet cut, which in the hands of a less skilled barber surgeon can go wrong in ways that make the original illness seem like a minor inconvenience. Here's a quirky tidbit. Barber surgeons also performed something called cupping, which involved placing heated glass or metal cups on the skin. As the air inside the cup cooled, it created suction, drawing blood to the surface. The idea was to pull bad blood or excess humours toward the skin where they could be drained. Cupping has, improbably, survived into the 21st century as an alternative medicine practice. Michael Phelps famously appeared at the 2016 Olympics covered in circular bruises from cupping therapy. The medieval barber surgeon would have been delighted to know his techniques were still trendy 700 years later. Historians still argue about how effective medieval barber surgeons actually were. On one hand, their theoretical understanding of medicine was almost entirely wrong, and many of their standard practices, bloodletting, purging, cauterizing, either did nothing useful or actively harmed the patient. On the other hand, these were people who spent their entire careers working on human bodies, and some of them developed genuine practical skill through experience. Medieval surgical texts describe surprisingly sophisticated procedures, removing bladder stones, repairing hernias, performing cataract surgery by pushing the clouded lens down into the eye with a needle, a procedure called couching that actually worked, sort of, in that it removed the obstruction even if it didn't restore perfect vision. Some barber surgeons were genuinely good at what they did. The problem was that you had no way of knowing which ones. and there was no licensing board to sort the competent from the catastrophic. Anesthesia, meanwhile, is essentially non-existent in any reliable form. There are attempts. A concoction called dwale appears in some medieval texts, made from a terrifying mixture of hemlock, opium, henbane and other substances dissolved in wine or vinegar. A cloth soaked in this mixture might be held over the patient's nose, and in theory, the patient would lose consciousness. In practice, the line between unconscious enough for surgery and dead from a toxic cocktail of medieval sedatives was dangerously thin. Many patients simply endured their procedures awake, held down by assistants while the barber surgeon worked as quickly as possible. Infection after surgery is the real killer, and nobody understands why. The barber surgeon might wash his hands, or he might not. His instruments might be cleaned between patients, or they might not. The concept of sterilization does not exist. The idea that invisible creatures too small to see could contaminate a wound and cause it to fester and kill the patient is an idea that won't be taken seriously for another 5 centuries. In the meantime, a successful surgery, a tooth pulled, a wound stitched, a bone set, can still end in death weeks later when the surgical site becomes infected and sepsis sets in. You're looking at the barber surgeon. He's looking at you with the eager professional interest of a man who takes genuine pride in his work and has no idea how much of what he does is harmful. He gestures toward his chair. You think about your cough, your sore foot, the general state of your increasingly battered body. And then you think about the lancet, the leeches, and the cauterizing iron glowing in the hearth. You politely decline. You'll take your chances with the cough. The barber surgeon shrugs. There will be other customers. There always are. And you back out of his shop with the careful haste of someone exiting a tiger enclosure. The cough follows you into the street. It's getting worse. But at least you still have all your blood, and in medieval Europe that counts as a win. The day has been long, and the grey sky is finally darkening into something that more closely resembles actual night. In the modern world, this transition barely registers. You flip a switch, your house fills with electric light, and the darkness outside your window is an aesthetic choice, not a condition of existence. In medieval Europe, nightfall is an event. It changes everything. The town that was loud and chaotic and filthy, but at least comprehensible in daylight, becomes, after sundown, a different place entirely, a place of shadows, fear, and genuine danger. A mainstream historical fact, the medieval night was governed by curfew, and the word itself tells the story. Curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. At a designated hour, usually marked by, yes, a church bell, residents were required to cover or extinguish their fires. The practical reason was fire prevention. In a town built almost entirely of wood and thatch, an unattended fire could destroy an entire neighbourhood in hours, and medieval urban fires were devastatingly common. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is the most famous example, but smaller fires ravaged towns and cities throughout the medieval period. A knocked-over candle, a spark from a hearth, a cooking fire left burning. Any of these could be catastrophic. But curfew also served a social control function. After the fires were covered, you were expected to be inside, in your home, off the streets. The night was not a time for recreation. It was not a time for socialising. The streets after dark were by definition the domain of people who were up to no good, criminals, drunks, and anyone else who had reason to avoid the light of day and the scrutiny of their neighbours. If you were caught out after curfew, you could be arrested by the night watch, fined, or worse, and the darkness was absolute. There are no streetlights. There are no illuminated shop signs. There is no ambient glow from a city skyline. When the sun goes down and the fires are covered, the darkness that descends on a medieval town is a kind of darkness that modern people in electrified societies almost never experience. It is total. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. You navigate by memory, by touch, by the sounds around you. The moon helps when it's out, but on overcast nights, which is most nights, because this is Northern Europe, the darkness is a wall. Historians still argue about how much nighttime activity actually occurred despite curfew regulations. There's evidence that taverns stayed open late, that people visited neighbours after dark, that night markets operated in some cities. Curfew was a rule, but like many medieval rules, it was inconsistently enforced. The Night Watch, a group of citizens or hired men who patrolled the streets after dark, varied enormously in competence and diligence from town to town. In some places, the watch was a serious, well-organised force. In others, it was a handful of men who drank at their post and fell asleep by midnight. Your safety after dark depended heavily on the quality of your local watch, and you had no way of assessing that quality until it was too late. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval people carried small lanterns or torches when they needed to travel after dark, but this came with its own risks. A light in the darkness advertised your presence to anyone watching, and it also marked you as someone who might be worth robbing. After all, you owned a lantern, which meant you had possessions. Going dark was safer in some ways, but left you vulnerable to stumbling into ditches, tripping over sleeping animals, or walking straight into one of the many open pits, construction sites, and other hazards that littered medieval streets. The night was a choose-your-own-adventure of bad options. And then there were the actual predators. In the towns, the humankind, thieves, cutthroats, and desperate people who had nothing to lose. Violent crime in medieval Europe is difficult to quantify, but the evidence suggests that murder rates were significantly higher than in modern Western societies. Some historians estimate medieval homicide rates at 20 to 40 per 100,000 people, compared to about 5 per 100,000 in the modern United States. The darkness, the lack of effective policing, the prevalence of weapons, and the absence of any forensic investigation capability made killing someone relatively easy and getting away with it alarmingly achievable. Outside the town walls, if your town has walls, the threats multiply. Wolves are not a fairy tale metaphor in medieval Europe. They are a real, present, and frequently lethal danger, especially in winter when food is scarce and the packs grow bold. Wolf attacks on humans are documented throughout the medieval period, and in some regions, organised wolf hunts were conducted to keep the population in check. Travelling between towns after dark, through forests where wolves, wild boar and bandits all operate, is the medieval equivalent of swimming in shark-infested waters, wearing a suit made of chum. You're inside your little hovel now, and the fire, the one fire you're allowed, is burning low. The room is dim, flickering, full of moving shadows that your 21st century imagination turns into threats. You can hear the town settling around you, distant voices, a dog barking, the creak of wood, the scratch of something in the walls, rats, probably, or mice, or something else that shares your living space without paying rent. You lie down on your straw mattress, the darkness presses in, and you realise with a clarity that only total darkness can provide that the night is going to be very, very long. There are no distractions, no phone, no book. You can't read by this light, and you probably don't have a book anyway. No music, no television, no podcasts. Just you, the darkness, the sounds of the medieval night, and the knowledge that everything biting you is real. Sleep, when it comes, will be shallow and interrupted. Medieval people often practiced what historians call segmented sleep, sleeping in two distinct blocks, with a period of wakefulness in between. You'd sleep for a few hours, wake up in the deep middle of the night, spend an hour or so praying, talking, or simply lying there, and then sleep again until dawn. This is not insomnia. This is the natural rhythm of human sleep in a world without artificial light, and it was so normal that medieval people had specific names for it. First sleep and second sleep. You'll learn this rhythm whether you want to or not. The church bell will wake you. It always does. And tomorrow, whatever that brings, will begin exactly the same way, with the sound of a bell, the scratch of insects, and the dawning realization that you are very far from home. Your second night confirms what your first night suggested. Sleeping in medieval Europe is less a restful activity, and more an endurance sport in which the competitors include you, several species of insect, at least one family of rodents, and whatever human beings happen to be sharing your sleeping space. Because in this world, sleeping alone is a luxury almost nobody can afford. The concept of a private bedroom, a room that belongs to you, with a door that closes and a bed that is exclusively yours, is essentially a modern invention. In medieval Europe, beds are shared. Always. If you're part of a peasant family, you share the bed with your spouse, your children, and possibly your elderly parents. If you're a traveller staying at an inn, you share the bed with other travellers, strangers whose names you don't know and whose personal hygiene you'd rather not contemplate. If you're a servant in a wealthy household, you sleep on a pallet on the floor of whatever room you're assigned to, alongside other servants. Privacy in sleep is for kings, and even kings usually have attendants sleeping in their chambers. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval beds when they existed as actual furniture rather than just straw on the floor, were often the most valuable item in a household. They were large, wooden-framed affairs, sometimes elaborately carved, and they featured in wills and inheritance disputes. A good bed might be worth more than the rest of the household's possessions combined. The mattress was stuffed with straw for the poor, wool or feathers for the wealthy, and it sat on a network of ropes strung across the bed frame, which is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from, as the ropes needed to be tightened regularly to prevent the mattress from sagging. At least that's the popular etymology. Some scholars dispute it, but it's too good a story to let go. Your straw mattress is home to creatures that have been waiting for you all day. Fleas are the headline act: small, dark, incredibly agile insects that feed on blood and whose bites leave itchy red welts that you will scratch until they bleed, at which point they'll become infected because everything in this century becomes infected. Lice are the supporting performers. They live in your clothing and your hair, and they itch with a maddening persistence that makes concentration on anything else nearly impossible. Bedbugs, if present, round out the ensemble with their own particular brand of nocturnal torment. And then there are the rats. Rats in medieval Europe are not occasional visitors. They are permanent residents of every home, every warehouse, every church, every building. They nest in the thatch of roofs, in the straw of your mattress, in the walls, under the floorboards, anywhere that offers shelter and proximity to food. They are bold, numerous, and seemingly indestructible. And they carry fleas. Fleas that carry diseases. Diseases that include, most notably, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the Black Death. But we're not there yet. We're still just trying to get through the night. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval people were bothered by the vermin that shared their living spaces. Some scholars suggest that people simply accepted fleas, lice, and rats as inevitable companions, unpleasant but unremarkable like bad weather. Others point to evidence of active efforts to combat infestations, recipes for flea-repelling herbs, instructions for smoking out bedbugs, traps for rats and mice. People definitely tried to manage the problem. They just didn't have the tools to solve it. Insecticides are centuries away. Effective rodent control requires an understanding of rodent behaviour and ecology that doesn't exist yet. You fight the battle, and the battle fights back, and eventually you reach a sort of exhausted détente in which you acknowledge that the fleas are going to bite you, and the rats are going to scurry across your feet in the night, and you're going to lie there and endure it because the alternative is not sleeping at all. Here's a quirky tidbit. Remember that bolster cat from your first morning? Cats were genuinely valued in medieval households for their ability to control rodent populations. A good mouser was a prized asset. There are records of cats being included in rental agreements. Landlords might provide a cat with the property, much as a modern apartment might come with an appliance. The Welsh legal code of Hywel Dda actually set specific monetary values for cats based on their mousing ability. A cat that had proven itself a good hunter was worth significantly more than one that hadn't. Your feline roommate isn't just a pet. It's a critical piece of your household's pest management strategy, and you should treat it accordingly. You lie in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the medieval night. Something scuttles across the floor. Something else scratches in the wall. The person next to you, a family member, a fellow traveller, whoever fate has placed beside you, shifts and murmurs in their sleep. Their body heat is, admittedly, welcome, because the night is cold, and your single blanket, made of coarse wool, is doing its limited best. Heating after curfew is not an option. The fire is covered. The room cools quickly, and by the middle of the night, your breath may well be visible in the air. This is when the medieval night reveals its peculiar rhythm. You've fallen asleep exhausted, bitten, and cold. A few hours later, you wake. Not because of a noise, not because of a flea, though both are contributing factors, but because your body has completed its first sleep cycle and has entered the wakeful interval that is, for medieval people, a normal part of the night. You lie there. You might pray. You might talk quietly with whoever is beside you. Some historians suggest this was a time for intimacy, for quiet conversation, for the kind of reflection that the busy, noisy medieval day didn't allow. It was a private hour in a world with almost no privacy. And then gradually the second sleep takes you. It's lighter, more fragile, more easily disrupted by the pre-dawn sounds of a town beginning to stir. The rooster, That infernal, enthusiastic rooster will eventually shatter whatever rest you've managed, and the church bell will confirm what the rooster has announced. The night is over. The day begins again, and you emerge from your straw cocoon, bitten, aching, and already tired, to face whatever medieval horrors the next 12 hours have prepared for you. You scratch a flea bite on your ankle and wonder, not for the first time, whether the people who built time machines in science fiction movies ever actually thought about the sleeping arrangements. You've been here a few days now, and you've managed to avoid serious trouble so far. No major injuries, no run-ins with authority, no accusations of witchcraft. But today, the medieval justice system makes itself known to you for the first time, and what you witness is enough to make you want to wrap yourself in your lice-infested blanket and never leave the house again. It starts with a crowd gathering in the town square. In medieval Europe, a crowd in the square usually means one of two things: a market day or a punishment. Today, it's a punishment. A man has been accused of theft, specifically stealing a neighbour's pig, and he's about to face the consequences. In the modern world, this would involve police, lawyers, a courtroom, evidence, a judge, a jury, appeals. In medieval Europe, the process is shorter, more public, and significantly more painful. A mainstream historical fact, medieval justice operated on principles that would be unrecognisable to a modern legal mind. The central concept was that crime was not just an offence against an individual, but an offence against the community and against God. Punishment, therefore, was public, designed not only to penalise the offender, but to deter others and to restore the moral order. This is why punishments were carried out in the open, in the town square, with an audience. It was spectacle. It was supposed to be spectacle. The point was for everyone to see what happened when you broke the rules. The man accused of stealing the pig is placed in the stocks, a wooden frame that locks around his ankles, or sometimes his wrists and neck, leaving him immobilised in a public place for hours or days. While he's locked in place, passers-by are free to mock him, throw things at him, rotten vegetables, mud, occasionally worse, and generally treat him as a source of entertainment. It sounds cruel, and it is cruel, but by medieval standards the stocks are a relatively mild punishment. He's getting off easy. For more serious crimes, the punishments escalate rapidly. A thief might lose a hand, a repeat offender might lose both hands, or be branded with a hot iron so that everyone who sees them knows what they've done. Counterfeiting, debasing the king's currency, could result in being boiled alive, which sounds like an exaggeration but was an actual punishment on the books in some jurisdictions. Treason, the most serious of secular crimes, was punished by hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, a process so horrific that describing it in detail would violate the gentle, sleep-inducing atmosphere we're trying to maintain here. Let's just say it was thorough. And then there's trial by ordeal, which is the medieval justice system, at its most theologically creative. The basic idea is that God will reveal the guilt or innocence of the accused through a physical test. In trial by hot iron, the accused holds a red hot iron bar and walks a certain number of steps. The hand is then bandaged and inspected after 3 days. If it's healing cleanly, you're innocent. God has protected you. If it's infected and festering, you're guilty. God has revealed the truth. In trial by water, the accused is bound and lowered into a body of water. If you sink, you're innocent. The pure water has accepted you. If you float, you're guilty. The water has rejected you. The problem with sinking, of course, is that innocent people sometimes drowned before they could be pulled out, which was arguably a less than ideal outcome for a justice system. Historians still argue about how frequently trial by ordeal was actually used, versus how much it was a theoretical option that courts invoked mainly as a threat. There's evidence that many cases were resolved through more conventional means: witness testimony, oath swearing, financial settlements. The ordeal may have been a last resort, used when other methods of determining guilt had failed. Some scholars even suggest that the ordeal worked as a psychological tool. An innocent person would confidently submit to the test, while a guilty person, terrified of divine exposure, would confess beforehand. The ordeal didn't need to be scientifically valid. It needed to be frightening enough to produce results, and in that it seems to have succeeded. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval courts sometimes put animals on trial. Pigs, dogs, rats, and even insects were formally accused of crimes, assigned legal counsel, tried before a judge, and sentenced. In 1386, a pig in France was tried, convicted and executed by hanging in human clothes for the murder of a child. These weren't jokes, they were real legal proceedings, conducted with full judicial solemnity. The reasoning seems to have been that any creature capable of causing harm was subject to the same moral and legal order as humans. Or perhaps it was simply a society trying to impose order on a chaotic world by extending the law to everything that moved. You watch the man in the stocks, people jeer, a child throws a turnip. The man's face is a mask of shame and endurance. He knows the rules, he broke them, and this is the price. You look away, but there's nowhere to look that doesn't remind you of the fundamental precariousness of your position. You are a stranger. You have no lord, no family, no one to vouch for you. If you're accused of a crime, any crime, whether you committed it or not, your defense options are limited. You can swear an oath of innocence, but you need oath helpers, people who will swear alongside you that you're telling the truth. You don't have any. You can submit to an ordeal and hope God is in a generous mood, or you can accept whatever punishment is handed down and hope you survive it. Justice here is not blind. It sees exactly who you are, your class, your connections, your reputation, and it adjusts accordingly. A lord who commits a crime faces very different consequences than a peasant who commits the same crime. Wealth buys leniency, poverty buys pain. The system is, by design, unequal, and you're on the wrong side of the inequality. You leave the square quickly, keeping your head down. The man in the stocks will be there for hours yet. You've been reminded very clearly that this world has rules, and the consequences for breaking them are written not in law books, but on human bodies. And then, because medieval Europe apparently subscribes to the philosophy that if something can get worse, it absolutely will, the plague arrives. Or rather, you realise it's been here all along, lurking in the rats, in the fleas, in the very air that's been pressing against your lungs since you stepped into this century. The Black Death, the single most devastating pandemic in recorded human history, and you have a front row seat. The year, remember, is 1347. In October of this year, 12 Genoese trading ships dock at the Sicilian port of Messina, and the sailors aboard are either dying or already dead. They are covered in black swellings, the buboes that give the bubonic plague its name, oozing blood and pus, burning with fever. The disease has travelled from Central Asia along the Silk Road trade routes, carried by fleas that live on rats that live on ships. By the time the ships reach Messina, the plague has already swept through the Mongol Empire, through Persia, through the Middle East. Europe is next. A mainstream historical fact. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia between 1346 and 1353. In Europe alone, it wiped out roughly a third of the population. Some regions lost half or more. Entire villages were depopulated. Cities that had taken centuries to build were reduced to ghost towns. The demographic, economic, social and psychological impact was incalculable. It was by any measure one of the worst catastrophes in human history, and you're standing in the middle of it with an immune system that has never encountered Yersinia pestis, and a medieval medical system that doesn't know what bacteria are. The plague spreads fast, terrifyingly fast. It takes multiple forms, bubonic, the most common, which produces the characteristic swellings in the groin, armpits and neck, pneumonic, which attacks the lungs and can be spread directly from person to person through coughing, and septicemic, which poisons the blood and kills so quickly that some people die before they even develop symptoms. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague is around 50 to 60%. For pneumonic plague, it's essentially 100%. You contract it and you die. There is no medieval treatment that can change this. The people around you have no idea what's happening. The concept of contagion, the idea that disease passes from person to person, exists in a vague, unscientific form, but the mechanism is completely unknown. Some people blame miasma, bad air. Some blame astrological alignments. A conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in the sign of Aquarius was widely cited. Some blame earthquakes that supposedly released poisonous vapours from the earth. Some blame Jews, which leads to horrific pogroms across Europe. Entire Jewish communities massacred by terrified mobs looking for someone to blame. Some blame sin itself, which gives rise to the flagellant movement. Groups of penitents who march through towns whipping themselves bloody in a desperate attempt to appease an angry god. Historians still argue about the exact death toll of the Black Death, the precise strain of the disease, and the degree to which secondary infections and social collapse amplified the direct mortality. Recent genetic studies have confirmed that Yersinia pestis was indeed the causative agent, but questions remain about whether other diseases, typhus, anthrax, viral hemorrhagic fevers, may have contributed to the overall death toll. The medieval world didn't keep precise statistics, and the accounts that survive are coloured by shock, grief, and the understandable tendency of chroniclers to use dramatic language when describing something that genuinely felt like the end of the world. Here's a quirky tidbit. One medieval theory held that the plague could be warded off by sitting between two large fires, on the logic that the heat would purify the surrounding air. Another recommended avoiding bathing since it was believed that open pores allowed the pestilential air to enter the body. A third suggested that pleasant smells could counteract the disease, hence the flowers and herbs stuffed into plague masks. And a fourth, particularly optimistic theory suggested that the plague could be cured by placing a live chicken against the buboes to draw out the poison. The chicken, presumably, did not consent to this medical intervention. You can smell something different in the air now, or maybe you're imagining it, because fear has a way of making everything smell worse. But people are talking. There are reports from the next town, rumours from travellers. A merchant arrived yesterday looking pale and sweating. The word pestilence is on everyone's lips, spoken in the low, frightened tones of people who don't understand what's coming, but can feel it approaching. When the first cases appear in your town, the response is predictable and heartbreaking. Some people flee, packing whatever they can carry and heading for the countryside, not realising they may be carrying the disease with them. Some people barricade themselves in their homes, refusing to open their doors for anyone. Some people turn to the church, filling the churches with desperate prayers, which ironically gathers large crowds of people into enclosed spaces and accelerates transmission. Some people turn to drink and revelry, adopting the attitude that if the world is ending, they might as well enjoy what's left. And some people simply carry on because carrying on is the only thing they know how to do. The dying is not gentle. The buboes swell to the size of eggs or apples, black and hard and agonisingly painful. Fever sets in. The body aches. Dark blotches appear on the skin, hemorrhages beneath the surface. The smell of a plague victim is distinctive and terrible, and the speed. People who feel fine in the morning can be dead by nightfall. You haven't been bitten by an infected flea yet, or maybe you have and you don't know it yet because the incubation period is 2 to 6 days. Every flea bite, and you've received dozens since arriving, now feels like a potential death sentence. You scratch, and you wait, and you try not to think about the odds. The church bells are ringing more often now, not for the canonical hours, for the dead. When the world becomes incomprehensible, when disease kills without logic, when the church's explanations feel inadequate, when the physicians shrug and the barber surgeons pack up and leave town, people reach for anything that offers a sense of control no matter how irrational. And in medieval Europe, the gap between what people can explain and what they need to explain is filled by a rich, elaborate, and sometimes terrifying tapestry of superstition. You're surrounded by it now. It's in the amulets people wear around their necks. It's in the words they mutter before crossing a bridge or entering a forest. It's in the way a woman crosses herself when a black cat passes. It's in the careful, fearful glances directed at the old woman who lives alone at the edge of town, the one who talks to her goats and knows which herbs cure a fever. She's useful when you're sick, but when things go wrong, when crops fail, or children die, or the plague comes knocking, she's the first person the terrified townspeople will point a finger at. A mainstream historical fact. Belief in witchcraft was widespread throughout medieval Europe, though the great witch hunts that killed tens of thousands are primarily a phenomenon of the early modern period, the 15th through 17th centuries. In the medieval era, attitudes toward folk magic were more complex and more varied. The church officially taught that magic was real. The devil could grant supernatural powers to those who made pacts with him. But local responses to suspected witchcraft range from tolerance to terror, depending on the time, the place, and the current level of communal anxiety. A wise woman who cured sick children with herbal remedies might be valued in good times and accused in bad times. The line between healer and witch was drawn not by the woman herself, but by the community around her. Superstition in medieval Europe isn't a fringe phenomenon, it's woven into the fabric of everyday life. People consult astrologers before making important decisions, when to plant crops, when to marry, when to travel. Physicians check astrological charts before prescribing treatment. The positions of the stars and planets are believed to directly influence human health, personality, and fate. This isn't considered irrational, it's considered science. Astrology and astronomy are the same discipline, and they won't be separated for centuries. Relics are another cornerstone of medieval spiritual life. A relic is a physical object associated with a saint, a bone, a piece of clothing, a vial of blood, a fragment of the true cross. Churches compete fiercely to acquire relics because relics attract pilgrims, and pilgrims bring money. The faithful believe that relics possess miraculous powers. They can heal the sick, protect the city, ensure good harvests. The demand for relics creates a thriving market, and not all of it is honest. There are enough fragments of the true cross scattered across medieval Europe to build a small fleet of ships. There are enough bones of various saints to assemble entire skeleton armies. The authenticity of any given relic is at best uncertain. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval people genuinely believed in the power of relics versus the extent to which relic veneration was a social and economic institution that people participated in regardless of personal conviction. The answer, again, is probably both. Some people were true believers who wept at the sight of a saint's finger bone. Others were pragmatists who valued their local church's relic collection primarily for the tourist revenue it generated. And some, the educated, the skeptical, the quietly cynical, may have harboured private doubts, while publicly conforming, because publicly questioning the efficacy of relics was a quick way to attract the wrong kind of attention. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most popular folk remedies against plague was the plague stone, a stone with a natural hole in it through which you were supposed to pass the afflicted body part. Failing that, people tried a dazzling variety of alternatives, drinking powdered emeralds dissolved in wine, carrying a dried toad in a pouch around the neck, sitting in a sewer, the logic being that the plague couldn't survive in a place that smelled even worse than itself, or, and this one is a particular favourite, writing specific words or prayers on a piece of parchment and eating it. Literally eating the words. The medieval approach to medicine had a certain creative desperation that you can't help but admire, even as you back slowly away from the person recommending it. You're navigating this world of belief and superstition with the clumsy caution of someone walking through a minefield in oversized shoes. You don't believe in astrology, but when someone asks your birth sign, or rather, the configuration of planets at your birth, you need to have an answer. You don't believe in relics, but when the priest displays one during Mass, and the congregation drops to its knees, you drop too. You don't believe that the old woman at the edge of town consorts with demons, but when the mood of the community turns dark and people start whispering, you know enough to keep your distance and your mouth shut. Because the terrifying thing about superstition in a frightened community is that it needs targets. When the plague kills, when the harvest fails, when the river floods, the question, why is this happening, demands an answer. And if the real answer, bacteria, weather patterns, geography, is unknown, then the answer that fills the void is, someone is responsible. Someone made this happen. Someone is practicing dark arts, poisoning wells, cursing the community. And once that belief takes hold, it seeks a body to attach itself to, and the consequences for that body are severe. You keep your head down, you mouth the prayers, you nod when people offer explanations that involve planetary alignments or divine wrath. You avoid the edge of town where the old woman lives, and you add accused of witchcraft to the growing list of medieval ways to die that you are desperately trying to avoid. The church bell rings, you cross yourself. It's becoming automatic now, a reflex, a survival mechanism. And somewhere behind you, in the shadowed corner of a narrow lane, you're almost certain someone is watching. The morning of your 4th day, or maybe your 5th, the days are blurring together, marked only by bells and meals and the slow accumulation of flea bites, brings a new development. You've been assigned to work the fields. Whether this happened because you attached yourself to a household, because the local Lord's Reeve grabbed you out of a group of idle-looking strangers, or because medieval survival simply funneled you toward the one job that's always hiring, here you are standing at the edge of an open field with a tool in your hand and absolutely no idea what you're doing. The tool is probably a hoe, or possibly a mattock, a heavy, ungainly implement that looks like it was designed by someone who actively disliked the people who would have to use it. Your job, as far as you can determine, is to break up the soil in preparation for planting, or to weed between the rows of growing crops, or to do something else agriculturally essential, that the person who handed you the tool explained in a dialect you couldn't follow. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval farming operated primarily under the open field system, which is one of those organisational structures that seems logical in theory and exhausting in practice. A typical manor's arable land was divided into 2 or 3 large fields, and each field was further divided into long, narrow strips. Individual peasants held strips scattered across the different fields rather than one contiguous plot. Each year, one field lay fallow, left unplanted to recover its fertility, while the others were cultivated. This rotation prevented the soil from being completely depleted, but it also meant that a significant portion of the available farmland was producing nothing in any given year. The system demanded cooperation among the entire community, since everyone's strips were mixed together and ploughing, planting and harvesting had to be coordinated. The plough is the most important tool in medieval agriculture, and it is nothing like the precision-engineered equipment of modern farming. The heavy plough, developed for the thick clay-rich soils of northern Europe, is pulled by a team of oxen, and it takes multiple people to operate, one to guide the plough, one to drive the oxen, and sometimes additional hands to manage the team. If you don't have oxen, you might use horses, though horses are more expensive to feed and maintain. If you don't have either, you're using hand tools, and the amount of ground you can cover in a day is heartbreakingly small. Historians still argue about the productivity of medieval agriculture, and whether the open field system was an efficient use of resources or a brake on innovation. Critics point out that the scattered strip system wasted time as peasants moved between non-contiguous plots, and that the communal decision-making process resisted individual experimentation. Defenders argue that the system spread risk. If one part of the field was hit by disease or flooding, strips in other areas might survive, and that the communal structure provided a social safety net in a world with no other kind. What's not debated is that medieval farming was backbreaking, precarious, and entirely at the mercy of the weather. And the weather in the 14th century is not cooperating. You're living in the early stages of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling temperatures that began around 1300 and lasted for several centuries. Average temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, and the combination of cold, wet conditions created a perfect storm, sometimes literally, for agricultural disaster. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, just a generation before your arrival, killed millions across northern Europe when years of heavy rain destroyed crops and caused widespread starvation. The memory of that famine is still fresh in the minds of the people around you, and every dark cloud, every late frost, every day of unseasonable rain sends a tremor of anxiety through the community. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval farmers used a remarkable variety of techniques to try to influence the weather. Prayers and processions to patron saints of agriculture were common. Some communities rang church bells during thunderstorms in the belief that the sound would disperse the storm clouds. Others placed blessed candles in the fields or carried relics around the perimeter of the village. And in some regions, people practiced a form of weather divination, reading signs in the behaviour of animals, the appearance of clouds, and the timing of natural events to predict what the growing season would bring. They were wrong, more often than they were right, but they were working with the tools they had. You spend the day in the field, and by noon your hands are blistered, your back is a solid column of pain, and your appreciation for modern agricultural machinery has increased by approximately 7,000%. The work is relentless. Bend, hoe, straighten, move, bend again. The sun, when it appears, beats down on you. The wind cuts through your wool tunic. The soil fights every stroke of your tool, clinging to the blade, resisting your efforts with a stubbornness that feels personal. Around you, the other labourers work with a mechanical efficiency born of a lifetime of practice. They don't complain. They don't stop. They hoe with a rhythm you can't match, their bodies shaped by years of this exact work. Broad shoulders, thick hands, the permanent stoop of people who have spent more of their lives bent over a field than standing upright. You try to keep up. You fail. They notice but say nothing. A stranger who can't farm is a curiosity but not an interesting one. The reeve, the Lord's representative who manages the estate's day-to-day operations, passes through the field periodically, making sure everyone is working. He counts heads. He checks progress. He has the authority to fine you for slacking, and the fines come out of whatever meagre compensation you might receive. The system is designed to extract maximum labour for minimum return, and it works with a brutal efficiency that makes modern corporate management look positively humanitarian. By evening, you can barely move. Your hands are raw, your muscles scream, your stomach, which received only bread and weak ale at midday, is cramping with hunger. You walk back toward the town, or rather you shuffle because walking requires a level of physical competence your legs no longer possess, and you pass the fields that still need tending, the fallow ground that still needs ploughing, the fences that still need mending. The work is never done. It simply pauses when the light fails and resumes when the light returns. One bad harvest, that's all it takes. One bad harvest, and the grain stores that are supposed to last until next year's crop comes in run out early. The pottage gets thinner, the bread gets scarcer, people get weaker, and weakness in medieval Europe is a luxury that nobody can afford. You eat your evening meal in silence, too tired to speak, and fall asleep before the curfew bell. Tomorrow, the fields again, and the day after. And the day after that, stretching forward into a future that looks exactly like today, forever. You wake to a sound that has become distressingly familiar. Something alive in your house that shouldn't be there. In this case, it's a chicken. It has somehow gotten inside, through the door, through a gap in the wall, through sheer paltry determination, and it is now strutting across your floor with the entitled confidence of a creature that believes it owns the place, which in a sense it does, because in medieval Europe the boundary between human living space and animal living space is at best theoretical. Remember that your home, if we're still calling it that, is not a single-purpose dwelling. It's a multi-purpose structure that serves as bedroom, kitchen, workroom, and depending on the season and the weather, barn. In many medieval homes, particularly in colder regions, livestock were housed in the same building as the family. Sometimes they were in a separate section, divided by a low wall or partition. Sometimes they were simply there, sharing the warmth and the smell and the general ambience. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, all might share your roof, and their presence was considered not only normal but desirable, since animal body heat helped warm the structure during winter months. A mainstream historical fact, the longhouse style of dwelling, common in many parts of northern Europe, was specifically designed to accommodate both humans and animals under one roof. One end of the building housed the family, the other end housed the livestock. The design was practical. It conserved heat, it protected animals from predators and theft, and it kept the family's most valuable possessions, which the animals literally were, under direct supervision. The trade-off was that you lived with the constant presence of large animals and everything that comes with them. Noise, smell, waste, and the occasional cow stepping on your foot at 3 a.m. The streets outside are no better. Medieval towns are, by modern standards, open-range animal environments. Pigs roam freely, rooting through garbage and waste, serving, as we mentioned earlier, as the town's reluctant sanitation department. Geese patrol their territories with a territorial aggression that would impress a military strategist. Dogs, semi-feral, ownerless, perpetually hungry, form loose packs that scavenge and occasionally threaten. Horses and oxen navigate the narrow streets alongside human pedestrians, and the right of way belongs to whichever party is larger. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval towns regulated animal populations, and whether the free-roaming pig situation was as chaotic as it appears. There are town ordinances, fines for letting pigs damage neighbours' property, and rules about where animals could and couldn't go. But enforcement was patchy, and the basic reality is that human and animal lives in medieval Europe were intertwined to a degree that modern urban dwellers find genuinely difficult to imagine. Here's a quirky tidbit, and this one is almost too good to be true, but it is. Medieval courts, as we briefly touched on, sometimes held formal legal trials for animals, but the range of these trials is broader than you might expect. Pigs were the most commonly prosecuted, usually for injuring or killing children, but insects were also brought to court. In one famous case, weevils infesting a vineyard were formally summoned to appear before an ecclesiastical court in the town of Saint-Julien in France. They were assigned a lawyer, arguments were heard. The court eventually offered the weevils a designated piece of land outside the vineyard as a compromise. Whether the weevils accepted the ruling is not recorded. Beyond the walls of the town, the animal situation shifts from domestic to wild, and wild in medieval Europe means something more immediate and dangerous than modern people generally appreciate. Wolves are the headline predator. In the 14th century, wolf populations across Europe are large and well established. and attacks on humans, particularly children, lone travellers, and people in rural areas, are documented with disturbing frequency. France was particularly affected. Accounts from the medieval period describe wolf packs that grew bold enough to enter villages and take livestock from enclosures. Organised wolf hunts were a community responsibility, and some lords employed professional wolf hunters. But the forests were vast, the wolf populations resilient, and the threat persistent. Wild boar are another hazard, large, aggressive, and equipped with tusks that can inflict serious injuries. Bears exist in some regions, particularly in mountainous areas, and even domestic animals can be dangerous. Bulls are unpredictable, horses kick, and that seemingly docile cow you share your home with weighs roughly half a ton and can crush you against a wall without particularly meaning to. You chase the chicken out of your house, a process that takes longer than you'd like to admit because chickens are fast and you're not, and step outside into the usual chaos of the medieval morning. A pig is investigating something in the gutter. A dog watches you from across the lane with the calculating expression of an animal, deciding whether you're worth approaching. Somewhere a goat is eating something it shouldn't be eating, which in goat terms means it's eating something. This is the ecosystem you inhabit now. Humans and animals, tangled together in a web of mutual dependence and occasional mutual annoyance. The animals provide food, labour, warmth, and companionship. They also provide disease, danger, destruction, and a never-ending supply of waste that contributes to the overall environmental situation we've already discussed in vivid, regrettable detail. You can't separate medieval human life from medieval animal life. They're the same story, told from different heights. The church bell rings. Even the animals seem to respond to it. The dog lifts its head, the pig pauses its rooting, and you, along with every other creature in this town, carry on with the business of surviving another medieval day, side by side with beings that are in many ways handling it better than you are. You hear the hooves before you see them. A drumming, distant at first, then growing, the unmistakable sound of horses moving fast, and lots of them. The people around you react instantly. A woman grabs her child and pulls him inside. A merchant begins frantically packing his wares. The blacksmith stops hammering and stands in his doorway, listening, calculating. The mood in the town shifts from the usual background anxiety to something sharper, more immediate. Soldiers are coming. Warfare in medieval Europe is not the grand cinematic affair of cavalry charges across open fields that popular culture has taught you to expect. It is, for the vast majority of people, a local disaster that arrives without warning, destroys everything in its path and moves on, leaving broken communities to rebuild with whatever is left. And the people who suffer most are not the knights and lords who start the conflicts. It's you, the peasants, the townsfolk, the people who never asked for a war and have no means of escaping one. A mainstream historical fact, the 100 Years' War between England and France, which begins formally in 1337, a decade before your arrival, is raging throughout the period you're now inhabiting. But calling it a war somewhat understates the experience for ordinary people. It's more accurately a series of invasions, raids, sieges, truces, and resumptions of hostilities that stretch across generations. For peasants living in contested territory, the war is not a distant political event. It's a recurring nightmare. Armies march through your fields. They take your food. They burn what they don't take. And the soldiers themselves, whether English, French, or the mercenary free companies that roam the countryside selling their services to the highest bidder, treat the civilian population with a casual brutality that has no modern equivalent outside active war zones. The medieval practice of chevauchée, a mounted raid through enemy territory, is specifically designed to cause maximum economic damage to the civilian population. The goal is not to conquer territory or defeat an army. The goal is to burn crops, destroy villages, kill livestock, and terrorize the population so thoroughly that the enemy lord is forced to respond. You are not a target in the military sense. You are a resource to be destroyed, a means of applying pressure to your lord by making his lands ungovernable and his people destitute. Historians still argue about the total economic impact of medieval warfare on the peasant population, partly because the records are incomplete, and partly because it's difficult to disentangle the effects of war from the effects of plague, famine, and the general precariousness of medieval life. What's not debated is that for the people who experienced it, the arrival of an army, friend or foe, was a catastrophe. Friendly armies were scarcely better than enemy ones, because they also needed to eat. and they requisitioned food and supplies from the local population with the same disregard for whether those people would survive the winter. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval military contracts sometimes specified how much looting soldiers were permitted to do. The arrangement was essentially a business deal. You fight for me, and in exchange you keep whatever you can take from the enemy's territory. This created a perverse incentive structure in which prolonging a war and maximising destruction were in the financial interest of the soldiers doing the fighting. Some free companies became so successful at looting that they accumulated enormous wealth, enough to buy castles and lordships. War was, for some, a career path. For the people they visited, it was annihilation. The soldiers arrive. They're not here for a battle. There's no opposing force, no defensive wall worth besieging. They're here because they need supplies, and your town has supplies. The process is efficient and terrifying. Armed men spread through the streets. They take food from the market stalls, grain from the stores, livestock from the pens. If anyone resists, the resistance is dealt with quickly and violently. This is not theft by their reckoning, it's the right of an army operating in the field. There's a word for it. Purveyance, the legal right of the king's household to requisition supplies. In practice, it's indistinguishable from plunder. You press yourself against a wall and try to become invisible. A soldier glances at you, you're nobody. You have nothing he wants, and he moves on. You're extraordinarily lucky. Others are not. A man who argues when soldiers take his grain is knocked to the ground. A woman who tries to hide her chickens is shoved aside. The concept of civilian, someone who is not a combatant and therefore should not be targeted, will not emerge as a legal principle for centuries. In the medieval world, everyone in the path of an army is fair game. The soldiers leave within hours, taking with them a significant portion of the town's food supply. In their wake, they leave damaged property, traumatized people, and the quiet, grinding realization that whatever food was set aside for the coming months has just been reduced to whatever the soldiers didn't find or didn't want. The calculations change, the margins get thinner, the distance between getting by and not getting by narrows to almost nothing. You emerge from your hiding spot. The town is quiet in the way that places are quiet after storms, not peaceful, but stunned. People are already assessing the damage, counting what's left, trying to figure out how to stretch what remains. The church bell rings, not for prayer, not for the hours, but as a kind of all clear, a signal that the immediate danger has passed. But it will come again, it always comes again, and next time you might not be invisible. Next time you might have something worth taking. In medieval Europe, peace is not a state of being. It's a temporary gap between disasters, and the gap is never quite long enough. Let's talk about bathing, because you probably think you know this one. The popular image of medieval Europe as a civilization of unwashed, stinking people who never bathed and were proud of it is one of the most enduring myths in popular history, and like most enduring myths, it's partly wrong, partly right, and significantly more complicated than the version you've been told. Here's the truth. Medieval people did bathe. They bathed more regularly than the filthy Middle Ages narrative suggests, and in many cases they took their hygiene seriously. The Romans had left behind a bathing culture that didn't entirely disappear, and throughout the medieval period, public bathhouses, often called stews, operated in towns and cities across Europe. These were communal spaces where, for a small fee, you could soak in a tub of hot water, get a haircut, have a shave, and generally clean yourself up. In some regions, communal bathing was a social ritual, a place where people relaxed, socialised, and conducted informal business. Travellers, merchants, and townspeople all used them, a mainstream historical fact. By the 13th century, Paris alone had an estimated 26 public bathhouses, and many other European cities had similar facilities. Regulations governed their operation. Water had to be heated properly, prices had to be displayed, and bathhouses were required to announce their opening with a town crier or bell, so people knew when they could come in. Bathing was neither unknown nor uncommon. It was a recognised part of urban life. But, and this is a significant but, the bathhouses were complicated. First, they were expensive to operate. Heating large quantities of water required substantial fuel, and fuel was not cheap. Second, they were associated, not always unfairly, with sexual activity. Bathhouses in some cities functioned as thinly veiled brothels, and the line between bathing establishment and house of ill repute was frequently blurred. The church took an increasingly dim view of mixed-gender bathing, and moralizing sermons against the spiritual dangers of the bathhouse became more common over time. Third, and most fatally for the bathing culture, the plague changed everything. When the Black Death swept through Europe, people desperately searched for explanations and prevention methods. One theory that gained traction was that bathing opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to the pestilential air that was believed to carry disease. Hot water, it was thought, relaxed the skin and allowed the plague to enter. This theory, combined with the church's existing moral concerns about bathhouses, led to a significant decline in public bathing during and after the plague years. It's one of history's cruel ironies. A hygiene practice that was probably somewhat beneficial was abandoned partly because of a disease theory that was completely wrong. Historians still argue about the timeline and extent of this bathing decline, and about whether it was as dramatic as sometimes portrayed. Some scholars contend that bathing continued in private homes long after public bathhouses declined, and that the unwashed Middle Ages image is largely a creation of later periods looking back with smug superiority. Others argue that the combination of plague fear, church disapproval, and economic disruption genuinely reduced bathing frequency across large parts of Europe for several centuries. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle, varying by region, by class, and by period. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the absence of full-body bathing, medieval people developed a range of alternative hygiene practices that were surprisingly thorough. Washing the hands and face daily was standard. Linen undergarments, your chemise or shirt, were changed and washed more frequently than outer clothing, and the linen was believed to absorb dirt and sweat from the skin, effectively cleaning the body by proximity. Some people rubbed themselves with linen cloth soaked in scented water. Others used herbal preparations to freshen up. Teeth were cleaned with cloths, twigs, or mixtures of herbs and salt. The effort to stay clean existed. The means to stay clean by modern standards did not. You're standing outside the local bathhouse, one of the few still operating in your town, and debating whether to go in. The cost is a few pennies you can barely afford. The interior is steamy, noisy, and full of people in various states of undress. There's a wooden tub of hot water with your name on it, metaphorically, and the prospect of being genuinely thoroughly clean for the first time since you arrived in this century is almost overwhelming in its appeal. You go in. The water is hot, genuinely, gloriously hot. It's been heated over a fire, carried in buckets, and poured into a wooden tub that you share with nobody, because even in a communal bathhouse, individual tubs are available if you're willing to pay a bit extra. You sink into the water and feel something that might be joy, or might be your muscles finally unclenching after days of relentless tension. The dirt lifts off your skin in visible layers. The heat soaks into your joints. For a few minutes, you could almost forget where you are. Almost. The bathhouse also has its risks. The same communal water and shared spaces that make bathing possible also make disease transmission possible. Skin conditions, fungal infections, and other communicable diseases can spread in the warm, moist environment. The barber surgeon has a station in the corner, because of course he does, offering bloodletting and minor surgical procedures to a captive, relaxed audience. And the social dynamics of the bathhouse are their own minefield. Who you're seen with, what you say, how you behave, all of it is observed and potentially reported. But for now, you're clean, relatively, temporarily. And as you emerge from the bathhouse into the cool evening air, your skin tingling, your body lighter, you feel almost human again. The feeling won't last. The fleas will be waiting at home, and tomorrow's fieldwork will coat you in a new layer of medieval grime. But for this one moment, you understand something about the medieval world that the popular myths miss entirely. People cared. They cared about being clean, about being comfortable, about the small dignities that make the difference between surviving and living. They just had to fight much harder for those dignities than you ever have. If the medieval world is hard for you, a healthy adult with the advantage of knowing that a better future exists, imagine being a woman here. Actually, don't imagine it. Let me describe it. Because the reality is both worse and more nuanced than the simple narrative of oppression that medieval women's history is sometimes reduced to. Let's start with the worst of it. Childbirth. In the modern world, giving birth is a medical event supervised by trained professionals in a sterile environment with pain management, surgical backup, and emergency equipment. In medieval Europe, childbirth is the most dangerous thing most women will ever do. Maternal mortality rates are difficult to calculate precisely. Records are incomplete, and the causes of death were often poorly understood, but estimates suggest that between 1 and 2% of all births resulted in the mother's death. That doesn't sound catastrophic until you consider that a medieval woman might give birth 6, 8, 10 times or more over her reproductive years. The cumulative risk compounds rapidly. Childbirth is the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age in medieval Europe, and it haunts every pregnancy with the knowledge that this might be the one that doesn't end well. A mainstream historical fact, medieval childbirth was exclusively the domain of women. Midwives, not physicians, attended births. The birthing chamber was a female space, men were excluded, and the process was managed by the midwife with the assistance of other women from the community. Midwives learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience, and many were highly skilled. They knew how to manage normal deliveries, how to turn a breech baby, how to deal with the cord, and how to care for the newborn. What they couldn't do was address the complications that kill: hemorrhaging, eclampsia, obstructed labour, infection. For these, there was prayer, and sometimes there was a barber surgeon who might attempt a caesarean section, almost always fatal for the mother in an era without anaesthesia, antisepsis, or the ability to safely close such a wound. Beyond childbirth, a medieval woman's legal status is defined largely by her relationship to men. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property independently, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't appear in court in her own right. She was, in legal terms, under the cover of her husband, who spoke for her, managed her assets, and made decisions on her behalf. This is not universal. Different regions had different laws, and some areas granted women significantly more autonomy than others. But the general trend across much of medieval Europe was toward legal subordination. Historians still argue about the gap between legal theory and lived practice when it comes to medieval women. The law books paint a picture of total male authority, but the evidence from daily life tells a more complicated story. Women ran households, which in the medieval context meant managing food production, textile manufacture, child-rearing, healthcare, and household finances. In the absence of their husbands, whether through death, travel, or military service, women managed entire estates. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed significant autonomy, and some became powerful figures in their own right. The law said one thing. Reality, as always, was messier. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval women found remarkable loopholes in the system. Brewing, for instance, was dominated by women. The alewives who produced and sold ale were a major economic force in many communities. Some women participated in guild activities, either as femme-sole traders, women who operated independently in business, or through their husbands' guild memberships. And in the religious sphere, women who entered convents gained access to education, literacy, and intellectual life that was largely denied to their secular counterparts. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a composer, writer, philosopher, and scientist whose works were widely respected, an extraordinary achievement in any era, and a genuinely astonishing one in the context of medieval restrictions on women. You observe the women of the town going about their work, and there is so much work. A peasant woman's day begins before dawn and ends after dark. She cooks, she cleans, to the extent that cleaning is possible in a house with an earth floor and no running water. She processes food, preserving, salting, smoking, pickling. She spins thread and weaves cloth. Textile production is one of the most time-consuming and essential tasks in the medieval household, and it falls almost entirely on women. She tends the kitchen garden. She looks after children, including breastfeeding infants who are entirely dependent on her for nutrition. She may also work in the fields alongside the men during peak agricultural seasons, and she does all of this while navigating a social system that affords her limited rights and enormous responsibilities. The women around you are tough. This is not a romantic observation, it's a practical one. To survive as a woman in medieval Europe requires a physical and psychological resilience that modern life rarely demands. The combination of unrelenting labour, repeated pregnancy and childbirth, limited medical care, restricted legal standing, and the constant background threat of violence, from war, from crime, from the domestic sphere, creates a reality that is both heartbreaking and in its own grim way awe-inspiring. You watch a woman carry 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, a toddler clinging to her skirt, while simultaneously directing an older child to tend the fire. She does this without complaint, without pause, without any indication that this is remarkable. For her, it isn't. It's Tuesday, and tomorrow she'll do it again. The medieval world is not kind to anyone, but it saves a particular, comprehensive unkindness for the women who hold it together. And they hold it together anyway. The children of the medieval world grow up fast, or they don't grow up at all. There is no gentle middle ground. The numbers are staggering. Infant mortality, death in the first year of life, runs somewhere between 15 and 30% in most parts of medieval Europe. That means that roughly 1 in 4 or 5 babies born alive will not survive to see their first birthday. Extend the window to age 5 and the numbers climb further. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the sheer vulnerability of small human bodies in a world without modern medicine combine to create a childhood landscape that is, by contemporary standards, almost incomprehensibly dangerous. A mainstream historical fact, the causes of infant and child mortality in the medieval period were numerous and often mundane. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal diseases, malnutrition, either directly from insufficient food or indirectly from the mother's malnutrition affecting the quality of breast milk. Overlaying accidental suffocation of an infant by a parent rolling over onto them in a shared bed was common enough to be a regular subject of church sermons and cautionary tales. And then there were the diseases of childhood, measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, that swept through communities and took the youngest and most vulnerable. Medieval parents loved their children. This might seem like an obvious statement, but it needs to be made, because a persistent historical myth suggests that medieval people didn't form strong emotional attachments to their children because they expected them to die. This theory, popularised by the historian Felipe Arias in the 1960s, has been largely discredited. The evidence, from letters, from wills, from the anguished entries in monastery records, from the artwork that depicts grieving parents, overwhelmingly shows that medieval parents grieved deeply when their children died. They simply had to do it more often. Historians still argue about the concept of childhood in the medieval period, whether children were viewed as miniature adults, or whether there was a recognised stage of life with its own characteristics and needs. The answer is probably a bit of both. Children played. There are descriptions and illustrations of children's games, ball games, hide-and-seek, spinning tops, playing with dolls. Children were recognised as needing care, protection and education, but the window of childhood was shorter, and the transition to adult responsibilities came earlier and harder. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval toys have been found in archaeological digs across Europe, including miniature swords, tiny pottery cooking sets, carved horses and small figures. One particularly charming find from medieval London is a miniature knight on horseback, clearly a toy for a child fascinated by the same romantic images of chivalry that entertained adults. Children have always played, even in the harshest conditions, and the impulse to make something for a child to enjoy is as old as parenthood itself. By the age of 7 or 8, a medieval child's working life has begun in earnest. In peasant families, children help in the fields, tend animals, gather firewood, carry water, and perform dozens of small tasks essential to the household's survival. A child of 10 is a functioning, contributing member of the household economy, not by choice, but by necessity. In wealthier families, children might be sent away to other households to serve as pages or attendants, learning the skills and manners of their class through direct immersion. Boys bound for a trade would begin their apprenticeships. Remember those 7-year stints of unpaid labour, around age 12 or 13. Education in the modern sense is available to almost nobody. Schools exist, primarily run by the church, and they teach reading, writing and Latin to a tiny fraction of the population. The vast majority of medieval people are illiterate, and for a peasant child the skills that matter are practical. How to plough, how to harvest, how to repair a tool, how to slaughter an animal, how to preserve food. These are the things that keep you alive, and they are taught not in classrooms but in fields, kitchens and workshops, by parents and masters who learned the same way. You watch the children of the town, and the dissonance between their apparent age and their assigned responsibilities is jarring. A girl who looks about 9 carries a heavy basket on her hip, with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for years. A boy of perhaps 11 leads a team of oxen with calm authority. They are not playing at being adults. They are adults in all but name and legal status, because the medieval world cannot afford to let them be anything else. And yet they still play. In the gaps between tasks, in the stolen moments before the reeve comes around, in the fading light of the evening, children chase each other, throw stones at targets, make up games with rules only they understand. They laugh, they argue, they form fierce, passionate friendships that will last their entire lives, which might be long or might not. They are children, doing what children do, in a world that asks everything of them and gives very little in return. You see a boy trip and fall in the mud, and another boy helps him up, and they both laugh, and for a moment, just a moment, the medieval world doesn't seem so far from your own. Children are children, in any century. The difference is that in this century the odds against them are so much higher. The church bell rings, the children scatter to their tasks, and you're left standing in the lane, thinking about how much you took for granted, about school, about safety, about the simple luxury of being allowed to be young. You need to get somewhere. Maybe you've heard there's a market town with better prospects 20 miles to the east. Maybe someone's told you about a monastery that takes in travellers. Maybe you just want to get away from the plague, the soldiers, the fleas and the pottage. Whatever your reason, you're about to discover that the simple act of getting from one place to another in medieval Europe is an ordeal that would test the patience of a saint, which is fitting, because you'll probably need to pray to several saints before you arrive. 20 miles. In the modern world, that's a 20-minute drive or a pleasant afternoon bike ride, or a few stops on a commuter train. In the medieval world, 20 miles is a full day's journey on foot, and that's assuming good weather, good roads, and nothing trying to kill you along the way. All three of those assumptions are, to put it diplomatically, optimistic. A mainstream historical fact: medieval roads were, with a few notable exceptions, terrible. The Roman Empire had left behind a network of well-engineered stone-paved roads that crisscrossed Europe, and some of these were still in use in the 14th century. But centuries of neglect, weather, and the complete absence of any organised road maintenance system had reduced most of them to shadows of their former selves. The Roman roads that survived were the best options available, and people used them. But even these were potholed, overgrown, and sometimes blocked by fallen trees, collapsed bridges or landslides. Beyond the Roman roads, the road network consisted largely of dirt tracks that turned to impassable mud in the rain, which was, as we've established, frequently. You set out at dawn because you want as many hours of daylight as possible. Your footwear, if you have any, is inadequate for a long walk over rough terrain. Your clothing is not waterproof. You're carrying whatever food and water you could gather, which isn't much. And you're walking, because horses are expensive and you don't have one, and carts are slow and you don't have one of those either. Your feet are your transportation system, and they're already blistered from days of field work. The landscape unfolds slowly, achingly slowly. Fields give way to forest. Forest gives way to scrubland. Scrubland gives way to more fields. The track you're following is barely visible in places, and you're navigating by a combination of general direction, landmarks that someone described to you in an accent you could barely understand, and hope. There are no road signs. There are no mile markers mostly. There is no GPS, no map. Maps exist, but they're expensive, rare, and not very accurate. You're essentially navigating the way a bird does. Point yourself in the right direction and keep going. Historians still argue about the average speed of medieval travel, and how it compares to common estimates. The typical figure given for a person on foot is 15 to 20 miles per day, but this varied enormously based on terrain, weather, physical condition, and road quality. A mounted traveller could cover 30 to 40 miles per day. A royal messenger changing horses at relay stations might manage 50 or more. But for an ordinary person walking an ordinary road, your situation, 15 miles is an ambitious day, and 20 is pushing it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval travellers faced a hazard that modern hikers rarely consider: bridges, or rather, the absence of bridges. River crossings were major obstacles on any journey, and while significant rivers had bridges, built and maintained by towns, monasteries or lords, often funded by bridge tolls, smaller waterways frequently had to be forded. Fording a river meant wading through it, and the depth, the current, and the condition of the riverbed were all unknowns until you were in the water. People drowned at river crossings with depressing regularity. Some crossings had ferries flat-bottom boats that could carry people and animals across, but ferries cost money and weren't always available. And then there are the bandits. The forests that cover much of medieval Europe are not the managed, trail-marked recreational spaces of the modern era. They are wild, dense, and home to people who have made a living by robbing travellers. Outlaws, people who have been placed outside the protection of the law, either through criminal conviction or social collapse, lurk in the woods and prey on anyone passing through. A lone traveller with no weapons and no companions is exactly the kind of target they're looking for. Travelling in groups is strongly advised, and many medieval journeys are undertaken in the company of other travellers who have banded together for mutual protection. Safety in numbers, medieval edition. You're walking alone, which is not ideal. Every rustle in the underbrush makes your heart rate spike. Every distant sound could be hooves, could be footsteps, could be nothing. The forest is thick around you, the canopy blocking what little sun there is, and you're acutely aware that you're completely exposed. No weapons, no armour, no friend to watch your back. The day wears on. Your feet hurt, your legs ache, you're hungry and thirsty, and you've eaten half your food already. The landscape hasn't changed as much as you'd hoped, and the next town, the one you're aiming for, still feels impossibly far away. You're beginning to understand why medieval people, as a general rule, didn't travel unless they absolutely had to. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, diplomats. These people had reasons strong enough to justify the risk and discomfort. Everyone else stayed put because staying put was infinitely safer and more comfortable than getting on a medieval road and hoping for the best. As the sun begins to set, and you still haven't reached your destination, you face a decision that no modern traveller ever has to make. Do you keep walking in the dark, with all the risks that entails, or do you find somewhere to sleep by the side of the road and hope that nothing finds you before morning? You choose the roadside, you find a spot under a tree, wrap yourself in your cloak, if you have one, and lie down on the cold, damp ground. The stars appear above you, more of them than you've ever seen because there's no light pollution to dim them. It's beautiful. It's also terrifying, because you are utterly alone, utterly exposed, and the sounds of the medieval night are closing in around you. Tomorrow you'll walk again. If you're lucky, you'll reach the next town. If you're unlucky, well, you're already in medieval Europe. How much unluckier can you get? You've made it to the market town, bruised, footsore, and ravenously hungry, and you're immediately confronted with another dimension of medieval life that your modern experience has left you entirely unprepared for: the economy. You need to buy food, you need a place to sleep. You need, in short, to participate in the medieval marketplace, and the medieval marketplace operates by rules that would confuse a Wall Street trader. First, the money. Medieval currency is not standardized in any way that resembles modern financial systems. Different regions use different coins, and the value of those coins depends on their metal content, the reputation of the lord or king who minted them, and the willingness of the person you're trying to pay to accept them. The English penny, a silver coin, is the workhorse of the English economy, and 12 pennies make a shilling, and 20 shillings make a pound. But the actual silver content of a penny has fluctuated over the years, as various kings have debased the currency, and a penny minted in one decade might have a different real value than a penny minted in another. A mainstream historical fact. Coinage in medieval Europe was frequently manipulated by the authorities. Kings and lords who needed money for wars, for building projects, for personal extravagance, could order new coins struck with less precious metal, effectively reducing the value of the currency while nominally maintaining its face value. This is the medieval version of printing money, and it had similar inflationary effects. Prices rose, trust in the currency fell, and ordinary people, who couldn't afford to absorb the loss, suffered the consequences. But here's the thing. Most of the transactions you'll encounter don't involve money at all. The medieval economy, particularly at the lower levels, runs largely on barter. You trade eggs for bread. You trade a day's labour for a bushel of grain. You trade a repaired fence for a jug of ale. Money exists and is important. You need it for taxes, for rents, for market purchases. But in the day-to-day economy of the village, relationships and reciprocity matter more than coins. The market itself is a spectacle. Market day, typically once a week on a day specified by the town's charter, transforms the town square into a chaotic, noisy, colourful bazaar. Stalls line the square, selling everything from bread and meat to cloth. leather goods, pottery, tools and livestock. Travelling merchants bring goods from distant regions, spices, wine, silk, metalwork. The noise is extraordinary. Merchants shouting their wares, customers haggling, animals protesting, children running between the stalls. Historians still argue about how free medieval markets actually were, given the extensive regulations that governed them. Prices were often controlled. The assize of bread and ale, for example, set maximum prices based on the current cost of grain. Weights and measures were supposed to be standardised, though enforcement was inconsistent. Selling outside of designated market days and marketplaces was forbidden, creating a controlled monopoly that benefited the lord who held the market charter, since he collected fees from every stallholder. The market was simultaneously a space of economic activity and a space of economic control. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval markets had their own courts, called pea-powder courts, from the French pied poudreux, meaning dusty feet, a reference to the travelling merchants who used them. These courts resolved commercial disputes on the spot with immediate verdicts and immediate enforcement. If someone sold you a rotten fish or short-changed you on a weight of flour, you could haul them before the pie-powder court and get a ruling within hours. It was fast food justice. Not always fair, not always thorough, but undeniably quick. You're wandering through the market trying to figure out how to buy a meal. You have no money, or perhaps you've earned a few pennies through labour, and the merchants are looking at you with the appraising eyes of people who can spot a rube from 50 paces. Medieval market transactions are not fixed-price affairs. Everything is negotiated. The price of a loaf of bread depends on the quality of the bread, the current price of grain, the merchant's mood, your apparent wealth, and your haggling ability. And you have no haggling ability, because the last time you negotiated anything, it was your internet service contract, and you lost that one too. The swindling potential is enormous. Merchants might use weighted scales, dilute wine with water, mix flour with chalk, or use deceptive packaging. Butchers might sell meat from diseased animals. Brewers might sell ale that's been watered down or gone sour. The authorities try to police these practices. Market inspectors called altasters, or breadweighers, check products and punish offenders. But the inspectors can't be everywhere, and the incentive to cheat is always present. You manage, after some awkward gesturing and the surrender of your few pennies, to acquire a hunk of bread and a cup of ale. The bread is stale and the ale is flat, but they're food and drink, and right now that's enough. You sit on the edge of the market square eating your expensive mediocre meal and watch the medieval economy swirl around you. The deals, the arguments, the handshakes that seal agreements, the coins that change hands, the goods that move from stall to buyer. It's messy, it's inefficient, it's riddled with fraud and confusion and inequality. But it works, in its own chaotic way. People get fed, goods get distributed, the economy, such as it is, keeps turning, and you, sitting on the edge of it all, are beginning to understand that medieval survival isn't just about dodging plague and soldiers, it's about navigating a world where every transaction, every interaction, every exchange of goods and services is a negotiation, and you're negotiating without a single advantage. You finish your bread, brush the crumbs off your tunic and face the rest of the day. The market is winding down, the sun is shifting, and somewhere a church bell is ringing, because a church bell is always ringing. It's evening and the market is packing up, but the day is far from over, because in medieval Europe, entertainment exists, and it is wilder, weirder, and more dangerous than anything on your streaming service. The tavern at the edge of the market square is already filling up, and the sounds emerging from within suggest that the medieval concept of a good time is going to require some adjustment on your part. The tavern is a low-ceilinged room thick with smoke, sweat, and the smell of spilled ale. There are no tables in the modern sense. Long wooden trestles line the walls, with benches packed with people who have been working since dawn and are now making up for it with an enthusiasm that borders on the aggressive. The ale flows freely. This is the tavern's entire business model, and it's a good one, and the noise level rises with every round. A mainstream historical fact, the medieval tavern was far more than just a drinking establishment. It served as a community gathering point, a news exchange, a business venue, and an entertainment hall. In an era without newspapers, radio, or social media, the tavern was where you learned what was happening in the wider world. Travellers passing through brought stories, gossip, and information from other towns and regions. Local disputes were aired, alliances formed, and deals struck over cups of ale. The tavern was the medieval internet, slower, louder, and with significantly more fistfights. Speaking of fistfights, violence in medieval taverns was common enough to be unremarkable. Allay lowers inhibitions, and medieval inhibitions were already lower than yours to begin with. Arguments over dice games, insults real or perceived, old grudges reheated by alcohol, any of these could escalate into a brawl with remarkable speed. People carry knives, not as weapons necessarily. A knife is an essential everyday tool, used for eating, working, and a dozen other purposes. But in a heated moment, a tool becomes a weapon with disturbing ease. Tavern violence was a routine source of injuries and occasional deaths, and the legal consequences were often surprisingly light, particularly if both parties were drunk and the community considered the fight a fair one. The entertainment on offer goes beyond drinking. There's dice. Gambling is enormously popular in medieval Europe, despite the church's persistent attempts to discourage it. Dice games, card games, though cards are a later development, and betting on everything from cockfights to wrestling matches provide an outlet for the kind of risk-taking behaviour that has been part of human nature since we first picked up knucklebones and threw them. Historians still argue about the extent to which the medieval church's opposition to gambling was effective. The evidence suggests not very. Laws against gambling were passed repeatedly, which is usually a good sign that the previous laws weren't working. People gambled in taverns, in markets, in army camps, in the shadows of the very churches that condemn the practice. The desire to put something at stake and see what happens appears to be one of humanity's most irrepressible impulses. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most popular forms of medieval entertainment was bear baiting, in which a bear was chained to a post and dogs were set upon it. The spectators bet on the outcome. It was brutal, it was bloody, and it was wildly popular across all social classes. Bull baiting and cockfighting served a similar function. These were not fringe events. They were mainstream entertainment, attended by families, endorsed by authorities, and considered perfectly normal. The modern concept of animal welfare is many centuries away, and the medieval approach to animals, utilitarian, unsentimental, and occasionally cruel, is one of the areas where the gap between past and present is widest. But not all medieval entertainment is violent. There's music, folk songs, ballads, and drinking songs performed by travelling musicians or by the patrons themselves, who need no invitation to raise their voices after a few cups. The songs are often bawdy, shockingly bawdy by modern standards, with lyrics that would make a modern pub crowd blush. Medieval humour runs earthy and explicit, and the boundary between acceptable in public and not acceptable in public is drawn in a very different place than you're used to. There are also mystery plays and morality plays, dramatic performances, usually staged in town squares or churchyards, that depict biblical stories or allegorical tales of virtue and vice. These are major community events, organised by the guilds, and they combine sincere religious instruction with comedy, spectacle, and surprisingly impressive stagecraft. The devil is always the most popular character, played for laughs, equipped with pyrotechnics, and given the best lines. The audience loves to hate him, and the actor in the role is usually the most talented performer in the company. You're in the tavern now, nursing your ale, watching the medieval world at play. A man at the next table is losing badly at dice and taking it with increasingly poor grace. The group in the corner is singing something that involves detailed anatomical references and a priest. A woman is laughing so hard she spilled her drink. It's loud, it's chaotic, it's rough around the edges, and it's, you have to admit, kind of fun, in a terrifying, unsanitary, potentially violent way. Because this is the part of medieval life that the history books sometimes forget to emphasise. People had fun. Despite everything, the plague, the poverty, the pottage, the fleas, people found ways to enjoy themselves, to laugh, to celebrate, to forget, even briefly, the hardships of their daily existence. The tavern, the festival, the play, the game, these were not luxuries. They were necessities, as essential to survival as bread and ale. The human need for joy is as stubborn as the human need for food, and even the 14th century couldn't extinguish it. You raise your cup, someone at the next table raises theirs. For a moment, across 7 centuries, you share something that needs no translation. And then winter comes. You've been dreading this. Some part of your modern brain has been doing the calculation since you arrived, adding up the inadequate clothing, the drafty shelter, the limited food stores, and arriving at a sum that does not look good. Winter in medieval Europe is not the cosy snow globe fantasy of holiday cards and Christmas markets. It is a season of endurance, a months-long test of survival that kills the weak, the old, the young, and the unlucky with a quiet, relentless efficiency. The cold arrives gradually, then all at once. The days shorten, the grey sky turns greyer. The morning frost that tinged the grass becomes a permanent condition, and then the frost becomes ice, and the puddles that fill the street ruts freeze solid, and your breath hangs in the air inside your house, where the fire burns all day and the temperature is still barely above freezing. The cold is not an inconvenience, it is an adversary. It seeps through your wool clothing, through the gaps in your walls, through the thin soles of your shoes. It settles in your bones and stays there. A mainstream historical fact. The 14th century falls within the early stages of the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that affected Europe for several centuries. Average temperatures were lower than they had been in the preceding medieval warm period, and winters were longer, harder, and more unpredictable. Rivers that rarely froze began freezing regularly. Growing seasons shortened. The combination of colder temperatures and a population already stressed by famine and plague made winter an even more deadly season than it would otherwise have been. Heating is your most urgent problem. Your house has a fire, a central hearth probably, since chimneys are not standard in peasant homes. And keeping that fire burning is a daily priority. Wood is the primary fuel, and gathering it is a constant task. In theory, you have access to the commons, shared land where villagers can gather firewood, among other things. In practice, the competition for wood is fierce. The nearest forest may be miles away, and cutting timber from the Lord's woodland without permission is a punishable offence. Some people burn peat where it's available. Some burn dried animal dung. The smoke fills the house regardless of the fuel, and the combination of cold air and smoky air creates an indoor environment that is genuinely harmful to your lungs. The fire is everything. It heats you, it cooks your food, it lights your darkness, and it is terrifyingly dangerous. Open flames in a wooden structure filled with straw mattresses, straw on the floor, straw in the thatch of the roof, is a disaster waiting to happen. And in medieval Europe, it happens all the time. We've already discussed the fire risk, but in winter, the stakes are higher because the fire burns longer and hotter, and the temptation to pile on more fuel, to bank the fire higher, to let it burn through the night, is almost irresistible. House fires in winter killed people. Whole neighbourhoods burned. And when your house burns down in January with months of cold still ahead and no resources to rebuild, the consequences are catastrophic. Historians still argue about the average indoor temperature of medieval dwellings in winter, and whether the various heating strategies employed, fires, animal heat, shared sleeping, heavy clothing, were sufficient to maintain survivable conditions. The consensus seems to be, barely. Some archaeological studies of medieval hearths suggest that a well-maintained fire in a small enclosed space could raise the temperature to around 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the area immediately around the fire, dropping sharply as you moved away. The corners of the room, the floor, and anywhere not directly in the fire's warmth remained bitterly cold. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people slept in nightcaps, and not as a fashion choice. Heat loss through the head is significant, and in an unheated or barely heated room in the middle of a medieval winter, a woolen cap could make the difference between uncomfortable sleep and no sleep at all. People also slept in multiple layers of clothing, piled every available blanket and cloak onto the bed, and, as always, shared body heat with whoever was sleeping beside them. The medieval bed was not a place of rest, it was a survival strategy. The food situation tightens. Whatever was stored after the harvest, grain, salted meat, dried vegetables, preserved fruits, needs to last through the winter and into spring, and the calculations are unforgiving. Too much consumption early in the winter means starvation later. Too little consumption means weakness now, which makes you vulnerable to the cold and to the diseases that winter brings. The pottage gets thinner, the bread gets rationed, the ale gets weaker, and the hunger, a low, constant, gnawing hunger, becomes a companion that doesn't leave. Disease thrives. The cold weakens immune systems. The crowded, smoky indoor conditions facilitate transmission. Respiratory illnesses, the medieval equivalents of flu, pneumonia and bronchitis surge through the population. The old and the very young are most vulnerable, and the death rate in winter months is measurably higher than in summer. The churchyard receives more bodies, the church bell tolls more often. You huddle by your fire wrapped in everything you own, watching the flames and trying not to think about how many weeks of winter remain. Outside, the world is a frozen monochrome landscape of grey sky and white ground and the skeletal branches of leafless trees. The beauty of it, and there is beauty even here, is offset by the knowledge of what it costs. Every beautiful frost, every glittering icicle, every pristine snowfall is a threat, and the people who live here know it. Central heating. That's the thought that keeps circling back to you like a mantra, like a prayer. Central heating, insulation, double-glazed windows, a thermostat. The most mundane features of your modern home are, from this vantage point, miraculous inventions that separate comfortable existence from frozen misery. You never appreciated them. Nobody does, until they're gone. The fire crackles, the wind pushes against the walls. Somewhere outside, an animal makes a sound that you hope is just a dog. You pull your blanket tighter and wait for spring, because spring at least offers hope. Winter offers only endurance. So here you are, at the end of your week. Or what feels like a week. Though honestly, the days have been so blurred by exhaustion, hunger, cold, and the general assault of medieval existence that you've lost count. Let's tally it up. Let's see what you've survived and what in all likelihood would have actually finished you off. You woke up in a damp, vermin-infested hovel on a straw mattress that was more flea habitat than furniture. You stepped into streets that doubled as open sewers. You wore clothing that chafed, itched, and offered minimal protection against the elements. You ate food that was grinding down your teeth and offered nutrition that was marginal at best. You drank water that your immune system had no defense against, and ale that was only slightly safer. You attempted to find work in a rigid social system that had no place for you. You submitted to the authority of a church that controlled time, morality, and the boundaries of acceptable thought. You fell ill and discovered that the medical system was built on a theory of bodily fluids that was completely wrong. You narrowly avoided the barber surgeon and his enthusiasm for bloodletting. You survived pitch-dark nights in a world without artificial light. You slept with strangers and vermin. You witnessed a justice system that operated on public humiliation and physical punishment. You lived through, or at least alongside, the worst pandemic in human history. You navigated a world of superstition where the wrong word could get you accused of witchcraft. You broke your back in fields using tools that were centuries behind the technology you take for granted. You shared your home with livestock. You watched soldiers take what they wanted and leave. You bathed once, and it was the highlight of your stay. You observed the brutal realities facing medieval women and children. You travelled roads that were muddy, dangerous, and populated by people who would rob you. You participated in an economy that ran on barter, bad coins, and the hope of not being swindled. You drank in a tavern where the entertainment was earthy, and the risk of a knife fight was non-zero. And you endured a winter that tried to kill you with cold, hunger, and disease. A mainstream historical fact. Despite all of this, people survived. Not just survived, they built. They built cathedrals that still stand today, soaring achievements of engineering and art that took generations to complete. They developed legal systems, literary traditions, musical forms, and philosophical frameworks that shaped the modern world. They maintained communities, raised families, created beauty, and found joy in a world that offered them very little comfort. The medieval period was not a dark age of universal misery. It was a complex, vibrant, contradictory era of human civilization, and the people who lived through it were not pitiable victims of their time. They were resilient, creative, tough, and profoundly human. Historians still argue about whether the medieval period deserves its reputation as a time of suffering and backwardness, or whether that reputation is an unfair caricature created by later eras eager to congratulate themselves on their own progress. The truth, as with most historical truths, resists simple summary. There was suffering, immense, pervasive suffering that would be intolerable by modern standards. There was also beauty, innovation, community, and the irreducible human capacity to find meaning and pleasure, even in the most challenging circumstances. Here's a final quirky tidbit. One of the most common images associated with the medieval period is the Dance of Death. a motif in art and literature that depicted skeletons leading people of all social classes in a dance toward the grave. Kings, bishops, merchants, peasants. Death comes for all of them. It was a reminder of mortality, a levelling force in a deeply hierarchical society. But it was also, in its way, a celebration of life. You dance while you can, you dance because the alternative is standing still, and standing still in the medieval world is just another way of dying. You would not have survived this week, let's be honest about that. Your body, your skills, your expectations, your immune system, none of them are equipped for the medieval world. But the people who did survive it deserve your respect, your admiration, and your gratitude, because their survival, their stubborn, daily, unglamorous survival, is the reason the world you get to live in exists at all. And now, let's slow things down. Let the images soften. Let the cold medieval wind fade to a gentle murmur, like a breeze through curtains on a summer night. The church bells have gone quiet now. The town is still. The last embers of the fire glow a deep warm orange in the darkness of the little house where you've spent this impossible, extraordinary week. You can feel your own breathing slowing, deepening, settling into a rhythm that belongs not to the 14th century but to right now, this moment, wherever you are. The straw mattress becomes your pillow. The scratchy wool blanket becomes something softer. The sounds of the medieval night, the distant dog, the creaking timbers, the whisper of wind blend into a lullaby that has been sung, in one form or another, for 1,000 years. You close your eyes, the world dims, and all those centuries between then and now collapse into a single peaceful thought. You are here, you are safe, you are warm, and tomorrow when you wake, you will wake in your own time, in your own bed, in a world that, for all its problems, has running water, antibiotics, central heating, and soft sheets. So rest now. Let the medieval world slip away, like a story that's been told and finished and set gently aside. Let the darkness wrap around you, not the cold darkness of a medieval night, but the soft familiar darkness of sleep. Let every worry, every sound, every thought drift quietly downstream, carried away by the slow, steady current of the night. Sleep well, sleep deep, sleep the kind of sleep that only comes when you know, truly know, that you are exactly where you belong.